Welcome, fellow wanderer of flame and shadow, to the complete chronicle of the Fire Nation, a realm forged in volcanic fury and tempered by centuries of ambition, conquest, and eventual redemption. Tonight, we explore the rise and fall of an empire that shaped the world through fire and steel, from ancient lion turtle cities to modern industrial might, from the darkness of imperial conquest to the light of cooperation and peace. This is a tale of power and its consequences, of tradition and transformation, of how a nation's greatest strength became its most dangerous weakness, and how wisdom finally prevailed over conquest. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your mind drift as we traverse the ages of the Fire Nation together. In the time before memory, when the world was young and the boundary between spirit and flesh remained as thin as morning mist, the first humans to receive the gift of fire did so not through conquest or theft, but through the ancient benevolence of beings whose wisdom spanned eons and whose power could reshape reality with a thought. The lion turtles, those magnificent creatures whose shells could support entire cities and whose eyes held the accumulated knowledge of countless ages, served as bridges between the mortal realm and the infinite mysteries that lay beyond human comprehension. These earliest ancestors of the Fire Nation lived in harmony upon the backs of their protectors, their daily existence shaped by rhythms that modern civilization would find impossible to comprehend or accept. The lion turtle cities were marvels of organic architecture, their structures growing from the living shell itself in patterns that seemed to follow the natural flow of energy through the creature's massive form. Dwellings curved with the gentle rise and fall of the turtle's breathing, while communal spaces expanded and contracted, according to the needs of inhabitants whose lives were synchronized with their protectors' ancient biological cycles. The gift of fire came through energy bending, that most primal and dangerous of all arts, as the lion turtles could grant elemental power directly to human consciousness without requiring the years of training and spiritual development that would later become necessary for mastering such forces. The process was both intimate and overwhelming, requiring the recipient to open their entire being to cosmic energies that could just as easily destroy as empower, while the lion turtle's wisdom guided the transformation to ensure that mortal flesh could contain and channel forces that belonged to realms beyond physical existence. Those who received fire found themselves forever changed by the experience, their very essence infused with energies that connected them to the fundamental creative and destructive principles that governed all existence. Fire was not merely an element to be manipulated, but a living force that responded to emotion, intention, and spiritual alignment in ways that made the distinction between bender and bending increasingly meaningless. The flame that danced in their palms carried within it echoes of the cosmic fire that had birthed stars and would eventually consume them, making every act of firebending a participation in forces that transcended individual mortality. Yet this power came with purpose rather than mere privilege, as the lion turtle cities existed in constant tension with the spirit wilds that surrounded them on all sides. These untamed regions, where the laws of physics held less sway than the whims of ancient entities whose motivations remained incomprehensible to human minds, required regular expeditions for gathering the resources that sustained life within the relative safety of the turtle's shell. The spirits that inhabited these wilds were not uniformly hostile, but they were utterly alien, their interactions with humans following patterns that could shift without warning from benevolent assistance to lethal opposition. The fire wielders who ventured into these dangerous territories learned to see their element not as a weapon of conquest, but as a tool of survival, a means of creating light in regions where darkness could be literal death, warmth in places where cold was more than mere discomfort, but a spiritual emptiness that could drain life from living beings. The flames they carried served as beacons that could attract helpful spirits while warning away those whose attention would bring only suffering, while their ability to cook food and purify water made the difference between successful expeditions and disasters that left entire communities without essential resources. The hybrid pigs that these early humans domesticated represented their first successful adaptation to the unique challenges of their environment, creatures whose mixed heritage enabled them to thrive in conditions that would have been impossible for purely mortal animals to survive. These remarkable beings combined the hardiness and intelligence of conventional pigs with spiritual resilience that allowed them to accompany humans into the spirit wilds without being driven mad by exposure to forces that operated according to principles beyond normal biological understanding. Their meat provided sustenance that was both nutritious and spiritually neutral, important in regions where consuming the wrong foods could result in transformation into something no longer entirely human. The care and breeding of these hybrid pigs became central to the cultural identity of the fire-wielding communities, their success in maintaining healthy herds serving as measure of a group's overall prosperity and spiritual harmony. The animals' needs shaped daily routines and seasonal patterns, while their behavior provided early warning of spiritual disturbances that might threaten the community's safety. The relationship between humans and hybrid pigs was symbiotic in ways that went beyond simple domestication, creating bonds of mutual dependence that would influence Fire Nation culture for millennia after the original circumstances that created such relationships had been forgotten. But perhaps more significant than any practical adaptation was the warrior culture that emerged from constant exposure to dangers that could not be overcome through diplomacy, negotiation, or any form of peaceful resolution. The spirits of the wilds operated according to their own incomprehensible logic, their responses to human presence varying unpredictably, from helpful guidance to immediate attack without any middle ground that conventional social skills could navigate successfully. Survival required readiness for instant combat combined with the spiritual strength to face opponents whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the limits of mortal capability. This warrior mentality was not based on aggression or desire for conquest, but on recognition that the universe contained forces that could only be met through strength, courage, an absolute commitment to protecting one's community regardless of personal cost. The fire that burned within these early humans was as much spiritual flame as physical force, their bending abilities reflecting their inner determination to stand against chaos and maintain the order that made human life possible in a world that seemed actively hostile to their existence. The training that prepared young fire wielders for their responsibilities was both physical and spiritual, combining martial techniques with meditation practices that strengthened their connection to the element, while maintaining the psychological stability necessary for facing horrors that could drive unprepared minds beyond the boundaries of sanity. The masters who provided this instruction understood that their students' survival depended not just on technical skill, but on the kind of unshakable inner certainty that could maintain focus and effectiveness even when confronted with phenomena that seemed to violate every natural law they had learned to expect. Central leadership emerged naturally from these conditions as communities that lacked clear command structures proved unable to coordinate the complex operations that survival in the spirit wilds required. The expeditions that gathered resources, the defensive measures that protected the turtle cities, the diplomatic relationships with friendly spirits, and the military responses to hostile incursions all demanded coordination that could only be provided by individuals whose authority was recognized and accepted without question during moments when hesitation could result in catastrophic failure. The leaders who proved most successful were those who combined martial prowess with spiritual insight. Their ability to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure, balanced by wisdom that recognized when force was necessary and when alternative approaches might serve their communities better. These individuals became focal points for group identity and cultural development, their personal characteristics and decision-making patterns, establishing precedents that would shape their people's values and expectations for generations to come. The failed settlement attempts in the Spirit Wilds that marked several early communities revealed both the expansionist tendencies that would eventually characterize Fire Nation, imperial ambitions, and the practical limitations that even enhanced human capabilities faced when confronting forces that operated beyond mortal comprehension. These expeditions were launched with careful preparation and adequate resources, led by experienced individuals whose knowledge of spirit world dangers should have enabled them to establish viable outposts beyond the protection of the Lion Turtle cities. The failure of these settlements was not due to inadequate planning or insufficient courage, but to fundamental incompatibility between human needs and spirit world conditions that made permanent habitation impossible, regardless of the pate, determination, and abilities that settlers brought to their efforts. The spirits that inhabited these regions operated according to temporal and spatial principles that made consistent resource gathering impossible, while their unpredictable interactions with human presence created security challenges that no amount of martial skill or elemental mastery could reliably address. Yet the very attempt to establish such settlements demonstrated the restless energy that would later drive Fire Nation expansion across the known world. The conviction that human intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle through proper application of available resources and technologies. The failure of these early expeditions provided lessons about the limits of mortal ambition, but it did not eliminate the underlying drive to explore, expand, and extend human influence into regions that had previously been beyond their reach or control. The gradual decline of the Lion Turtle cities began not through any single catastrophic event, but through the slow accumulation of changes that made their protective role increasingly difficult to maintain effectively. The Spirit Wilds were growing more dangerous as the balance between worlds shifted in response to forces that even the Lion Turtles could not fully understand or control, while the human populations they protected were developing capabilities and ambitions that made continued dependence on their guardians feel restrictive rather than beneficial. The decision of the Lion Turtles to renounce their role as protectors of mankind was made with the wisdom of ages and the sorrow of parents watching children leave home to face a dangerous world without the safety and security that loving guidance had provided. These ancient beings understood that continued protection would ultimately weaken the humans they sought to help, preventing the growth and development that would enable them to face the challenges that lay ahead in their own expanding world. The pronouncement that ended the age of Lion Turtle cities was delivered with ceremonial gravity that befitted the magnitude of change it represented, the ancient guardians explaining that humanity's time of sheltered growth was ending, and that their survival would depend on their ability to apply the lessons learned during their period of protection. The gifts that had been granted through energy bending would remain, but the recipients would need to develop their own methods for passing such abilities to future generations while creating social structures that could maintain stability without relying on the wisdom and power of immortal protectors. The migration that followed this pronouncement was both practical necessity and symbolic journey, as the fire-wielding communities left behind the only homes they had ever known to establish new settlements in regions that offered opportunity along with unprecedented dangers. The Western Hemisphere's equatorial regions, provided the volcanic activity and warm climates that would prove most conducive to firebender development, while the island geography offered natural protection that could substitute partially for the security that lion turtle shells had provided. The establishment of permanent settlements along the equator required adaptation to environmental conditions that differed dramatically from life aboard the lion turtle cities, as the humans learned to work with volcanic soil, seasonal weather patterns, and terrestrial ecosystems that operated according to principles they had never needed to understand during their previous existence. The fire that had been a tool for survival in the spirit wilds became a resource for shaping their new environment, clearing land for agriculture, providing energy for basic industries, and creating the infrastructure that permanent communities required to thrive. The cultural practices that emerged during this transition period combined elements inherited from lion turtle city life with innovations necessary for success in their new circumstances, creating synthesis that honored their past while serving present needs. The spiritual observances that had maintained harmony between human communities and their ancient protectors were modified to address relationships with local spirits and natural forces, while social structures evolved to provide the leadership and coordination that successful settlements required without the overarching authority that lion turtles had represented. The development of hybrid pig husbandry into a central element of Fire Nation culture reflected both practical necessity and spiritual significance, as these animals provided not just sustenance but connection to the deeper principles that had guided their ancestors' relationship with forces beyond normal understanding. The care required for maintaining healthy herds taught patience and attention to detail, while the animals' responses to spiritual disturbances provided early warning systems that could mean the difference between community survival and catastrophic destruction. The foundation myths that grew from these experiences would shape Fire Nation identity for thousands of years, creating narratives that explained their unique capabilities while establishing expectations about their role in the broader world. The stories told around evening fires emphasized themes of strength through adversity, unity through shared purpose, and the responsibility that came with possessing abilities that set them apart from other human communities. These tales provided moral frameworks that guided individual behavior while reinforcing group cohesion during periods when external pressures might otherwise have fragmented their society. The architectural traditions that began during this period reflected both practical requirements and aesthetic principles inherited from lion turtle city design, as the first permanent structures attempted to recreate the organic harmony that had characterized their previous homes, while adapting to materials and building techniques that terrestrial construction required. The curves and flowing lines that would later become characteristic of Fire Nation architecture emerged from these early attempts to honor their past while creating spaces that served their evolving needs. As the first generation of permanent settlers aged and began passing leadership to their children, the communities they had established were already showing signs of the cultural characteristics that would define the Fire Nation throughout its history. The warrior traditions that had been necessary for survival in the spirit wilds were becoming formalized systems of training and advancement, while the spiritual practices that had maintained harmony with ancient guardians were evolving into religious observances that could be maintained by human spiritual leaders rather than immortal beings. The technological innovations that emerged from the necessity of working with volcanic environments and island geography laid foundations for the industrial capabilities that would eventually make the Fire Nation the most advanced civilization in the world. The understanding of heat, metallurgy, and chemical processes that came from living with active volcanoes provided knowledge that would prove invaluable for later developments in engineering and manufacturing, while the maritime skills required for island life created expertise that would enable future expansion across oceanic distances. The social hierarchies that developed during this formative period reflected both the leadership structures that had emerged during the migration and the practical requirements of communities that needed clear authority for managing complex relationships with environmental forces and neighboring settlements. The individuals who had proven most successful at leading their people through the challenges of establishing permanent homes naturally assumed positions of continued leadership, while their decision-making patterns established precedents that would influence Fire Nation governance for generations to come. As the scattered settlements gradually developed trade relationships and mutual defense agreements, the foundations were being laid for the eventual political unification that would transform the Fire Islands from a collection of independent communities into a single nation with coordinated policies and shared identity. The common heritage that all the settlements shared from their Lion Turtle city origins provided cultural basis for cooperation, while their similar environmental challenges created practical incentives for working together towards solutions that benefited everyone involved. The spiritual traditions that had been inherited from the age of Lion Turtle protection began evolving into the religious practices that would eventually become formalized as the Fire Sage orders, while the leadership skills that had been necessary for community survival started developing into the political capabilities that would enable effective governance of larger and more complex populations. The foundation was being laid for everything that would follow in Fire Nation history, from the golden ages of prosperity and achievement to the dark periods of imperial conquest and eventual redemption through wisdom and cooperation. In the golden age that dawned across the Fire Islands after the Great Migration from the Lion Turtle cities, when the first permanent settlements had taken root in volcanic soil and begun to flourish under equatorial suns, there arose a civilization whose understanding of fire transcended everything that had come before, whose mastery of their element reached heights that would not be equaled for thousands of years to come. The Sun Warriors, as they would be remembered in whispered legends and half-forgotten songs, represented the purest expression of what firebending could become when practiced not as a tool of survival or weapon of war, but as a sacred art that connected mortal consciousness to the fundamental forces of creation itself. Their cities rose from the mountainsides like flowers of stone and flame, their architecture following principles that seemed to grow organically from the volcanic landscape rather than being imposed upon it through human will and engineering. The temples and palaces that crowned their settlements were marvels of construction that appeared to have been shaped by fire itself, their walls flowing in curves that captured and channeled the natural movement of flame, while their spires reached toward the sky with the same aspiring grace that characterized the element they served. Every structure seemed to breathe with inner light, as if the stones themselves had been infused with the sacred fire that their builders wielded with such unprecedented skill and understanding. The Sun Warriors had discovered what their descendants would spend centuries trying to rediscover, that the true masters of firebending were not humans at all, but the ancient dragons whose wisdom spanned millennia and whose flames contained secrets that no mortal mind could fully comprehend without guidance from these magnificent beings. The relationship between the Sun Warriors and the dragons was not one of master and student in any conventional sense, but rather a partnership between species that recognized their mutual dependence and shared commitment to preserving the sacred knowledge that connected them both to cosmic forces beyond ordinary understanding. The dragons that served as teachers to the Sun Warriors were beings of such majesty and power that their very presence transformed the consciousness of those privileged to learn from them. Ran and Shaw, the great crimson and azure dragons whose names would echo through history long after their existence was thought to be mere legend, embodied the dual nature of fire itself. In their contrasting but complementary essences, Ran's flames burned with the passionate intensity of creation and growth, while Shaw's fire carried the cooler wisdom of transformation and renewal, and together they demonstrated that mastery of the element required understanding both its capacity to give life and its power to consume what no longer served the greater harmony. The techniques that the dragons taught went beyond mere manipulation of external flames to encompass the cultivation of inner fire, the spiritual combustion that occurred when consciousness aligned itself perfectly with the elemental forces that flowed through all existence. The Sun Warriors learned that true firebending began not with physical movements or breathing exercises, though these had their place, but with the recognition that the fire within their bodies was part of the same cosmic flame that burned in the hearts of stars and would eventually consume the universe itself in the great cycle of creation and destruction that governed all reality. The forms that emerged from this teaching were unlike anything that later firebenders would develop through purely human innovation and experimentation. Where future generations would emphasize aggression and overwhelming force, the Sun Warriors' techniques flowed like liquid light, their movements following patterns that seemed to dance with invisible currents of energy rather than imposing human will upon reluctant elements. Their firebending was simultaneously more powerful and more gentle than what would come after, capable of effects that seemed miraculous while maintaining perfect harmony with the natural order, rather than violating it through crude applications of superior strength. The philosophical foundations that supported these advanced techniques were rooted in understanding that fire was fundamentally the element of life rather than destruction, that its true nature was to nurture growth and enable transformation, rather than to burn away obstacles through brute force. The Sun Warriors recognized that every flame contained the potential for both creation and annihilation, but they had learned to emphasize the creative aspects while using destruction only when it served larger purposes of renewal and positive change. Their bending embodied wisdom that saw beyond immediate effects to long-term consequences, beyond individual desires to universal harmony. The architecture that housed these enlightened practitioners reflected their understanding of fire's true nature through design principles that worked with elemental forces rather than constraining them within rigid structures that ignored their essential characteristics. The Sun Warrior temples were built to channel flame in the same way that rivers channel water, their passages and chambers designed to encourage the natural flow of thermal currents while creating spaces where fire could exist in its pure form without being shaped by human intention or manipulation. The sacred flames that burned in their deepest sanctuaries were extensions of the cosmic fire rather than mere products of combustible materials, eternal lights that connected their civilization to forces that transcended mortal understanding. The art that adorned these temples depicted not the military victories or political achievements that later civilizations would celebrate, but the fundamental relationships that connected all existence through webs of energy and transformation that made individual identity both real and illusory simultaneously. The murals and sculptures that covered their walls showed dragons and humans working together as partners in cosmic harmony, their forms intertwining in patterns that suggested the dance of elemental forces through the material world. These artistic works served not merely as decoration but as teaching tools that conveyed spiritual truths through visual symbols that could be understood by consciousness prepared to perceive their deeper meanings. The spiritual practices that flourished within Sun Warrior society emphasized meditation techniques that enabled practitioners to experience their connection to the universal fire directly rather than simply believing in it as abstract, philosophical concept. The advanced masters could enter states of consciousness, where the boundaries between self and element dissolved entirely, allowing them to become pure channels for cosmic forces, while maintaining enough individual awareness to guide such power toward beneficial purposes. These experiences were both ecstatic and terrifying, revealing the infinite scope of existence while demonstrating how small individual human concerns appeared when viewed from cosmic perspectives. The daily life of Sun Warrior communities was organized around rhythms that honored the natural cycles of elemental energy. Their activities timed to coincide with periods when fire flowed most freely through the physical world, and their rest periods scheduled to allow for the kind of deep meditation that maintained spiritual alignment with forces that operated beyond normal time constraints. The work that sustained their civilization was performed as spiritual practice rather than mere economic necessity, their craftsmanship reflecting the same principles of harmony and balance that governed their most advanced firebending techniques. The dragons that taught them were not merely instructors, but partners in cosmic responsibility, ancient beings whose wisdom had been earned through eons of experience, and whose commitment to preserving essential knowledge transcended any concern for personal advantage or species loyalty. These magnificent creatures had chosen to share their secrets with humanity because they recognized that the preservation of cosmic balance required cooperation between all conscious beings, that the challenges facing existence itself were too vast and complex to be addressed by any single species working in isolation. The relationship between the Sun Warriors and their dragon teachers was characterized by mutual respect and shared dedication to purposes that extended far beyond immediate, practical concerns to encompass the long-term welfare of consciousness itself throughout the universe. The dragons provided knowledge and guidance that no human mind could have developed independently, while the Sun Warriors offered the kind of creative adaptation and innovative application that their immortal teachers, despite their vast wisdom, could not achieve without mortal partnership. Together they created synthesis of knowledge and capability that transcended what either could have accomplished alone. The techniques that emerged from this collaboration were preserved not merely in written form but through living tradition that required continuous practice and direct transmission from master to student across generations. The most advanced forms could not be learned from books or diagrams, but demanded the kind of intuitive understanding that could only be developed through years of patient study under teachers who had themselves mastered not just the physical movements, but the spiritual principles that made such movements effective channels for cosmic forces. The Sun Warriors' understanding of fire's relationship to the other elements was far more sophisticated than anything their successors would achieve, recognizing that true mastery required comprehension of how elemental forces interacted and supported each other, rather than existing in isolation or competition. Their advanced practitioners could demonstrate techniques that seemed to violate the boundaries between elements, showing how fire could create the conditions for earth to form, water to flow, and air to move in patterns that served purposes beyond what any single element could accomplish independently. The golden age of Sun Warrior civilization lasted for centuries, their society reaching heights of achievement in both spiritual and practical matters that established standards of excellence that would influence all subsequent development in the Fire Islands. Their scholars made discoveries in astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy that provided foundations for technological advancement, while their artists created works of beauty and meaning that conveyed spiritual truths through forms that could inspire and educate consciousness across cultural and temporal boundaries. But even as their civilization flourished and their understanding deepened, the Sun Warriors remained aware that forces beyond their control were moving in the wider world, that changes were approaching that would test their wisdom and challenge their commitment to the principles that had made their achievements possible. The islands around them were experiencing increasing warfare as other settlements developed along different lines, emphasizing military strength and territorial expansion rather than spiritual development and harmonious coexistence with natural forces. The gradual decline that began to affect Sun Warrior society was not due to any failure in their understanding or weakening of their commitment to cosmic principles, but rather to external pressures that made their way of life increasingly difficult to maintain in a world that was moving toward conflict rather than cooperation. The communities around them were developing military technologies and aggressive tactics that threatened to overwhelm even the most advanced spiritual achievements if confronted through direct resistance, while the dragons who had been their teachers and partners were beginning to withdraw from active involvement in human affairs. The decision to go into hiding was made not from cowardice or despair, but from recognition that their knowledge and achievements were too valuable to be lost in conflicts that would serve no constructive purpose regardless of their outcome. The Sun Warriors understood that their civilization's greatest contribution to future generations would not be military victory over their enemies, but preservation of the wisdom they had gained through centuries of cooperation with Dragon Masters and dedication to cosmic harmony rather than narrow human concerns. The withdrawal from public prominence was accomplished gradually and with careful attention to ensuring that their most important knowledge would survive even if their civilization itself could not be maintained openly. The techniques and principles that had enabled their greatest achievements were preserved through multiple methods, some obvious to those who might discover their ruins in future ages, others hidden so deeply that only those who had achieved true understanding of fire's nature could recognize and interpret them correctly. The temples and sacred sites that they abandoned were designed to serve as teaching tools for worthy students who might appear centuries or millennia later, their architecture and artwork conveying essential principles through symbolic representations that could be decoded by consciousness prepared to receive such knowledge. The dragons who had been their partners remained guardians of these sites, protecting them from desecration while waiting for the time when new students would appear who were ready to resume the ancient partnership between human creativity and dragon wisdom. The influence that Sun Warrior civilization had on later Fire Nation development was profound but often unrecognized, their architectural principles appearing in structures built by people who had no conscious knowledge of their origins, their spiritual insights emerging in philosophical discussions among thinkers who believed they were developing original ideas. The templates they had established for advanced firebending continued to influence the development of techniques that bore little surface resemblance to their original forms, while their understanding of fire's true nature provided invisible foundation for achievements that seemed to come from purely human innovation. The cultural legacy that the Sun Warriors left behind was embedded so deeply in Fire Nation identity that it functioned as unconscious heritage rather than explicit tradition, shaping values and expectations in ways that operated below the level of conscious recognition, while providing continuity that connected later generations to wisdom that their immediate ancestors had forgotten or actively rejected. The emphasis on honor, courage, and dedication to larger purposes that would characterize Fire Nation culture, even during its darkest periods, could be traced back to principles that the Sun Warriors had embodied through their cooperation with dragon teachers and Binya, commitment to cosmic responsibility. The technological innovations that had supported Sun Warrior civilization were lost more completely than their spiritual insights. Their advanced understanding of metallurgy, construction techniques, and energy manipulation disappearing, along with the social structures that had made such knowledge practical and sustainable. Later generations would have to rediscover these capabilities through different approaches that emphasized industrial efficiency over harmonic integration, practical application over spiritual significance, immediate results over long-term consequences. But the sacred flames that had burned in the deepest chambers of Sun Warrior temples never died completely. Their eternal fires maintained by dragon guardians who understood that such lights represented connections to cosmic forces that transcended the rise and fall of individual civilizations. These flames would wait through centuries of darkness and ignorance, ready to kindle new understanding in hearts, prepared to receive the ancient wisdom that had made the Sun Warriors the greatest firebending civilization in recorded history. The ruins that remained after their withdrawal would puzzle archaeologists and historians for thousands of years, their sophisticated engineering and artistic achievement challenging assumptions about the capabilities of ancient peoples, while their symbolic representations of spiritual truths remained largely unrecognized by scholars trained to analyze political and economic factors rather than cosmic and elemental relationships. The true significance of Sun Warrior civilization would not be understood until Avatar Aang and Fire Lord Zuko encountered the last dragons and experienced for themselves the profound transformation that came from learning fire's true nature from its original masters. And so the Sun Warriors passed into legend and myth, their actual achievements becoming stories told around evening fires, their profound wisdom reduced to children's tales about magical times when humans and dragons lived together in harmony. But the flame they had kindled continued to burn in hidden places, waiting for the day when new students would appear who were ready to learn that fire was not the element of destruction and conquest, but of life, growth, transformation, and the cosmic creativity that connected all existence through networks of energy and love that made every consciousness both unique and universal simultaneously. In the chaotic centuries that followed Avatar One's momentous decision to close the spirit portals and separate the world of humans from the realm of spirits forever, the descendants of the fire-wielding lion-turtle communities found themselves scattered across an archipelago of volcanic islands, where the absence of cosmic guidance left them vulnerable to the darker impulses that had always lurked beneath the surface of human consciousness. The Western Hemisphere's fire islands became a crucible of conflict, where the noble principles that had sustained their ancestors during the age of spiritual partnership gave way to brutal competition for resources, territory, and the kind of temporal power that seemed to offer security in a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous and unpredictable than anyone had imagined possible. The warlords who emerged from this period of instability were products of necessity rather than ambition, leaders whose rise to power reflected their community's desperate need for protection against threats that ranged from hostile neighbors to the lingering spirits who had been trapped in the physical world when the portals closed. These early rulers possessed the martial skills and strategic intelligence that survival required, but they lacked the spiritual guidance and cosmic perspective that had once prevented such capabilities from being perverted into instruments of oppression and exploitation, rather than tools for maintaining harmony and defending the oppression. Innocent from forces beyond their ability to resist alone. Taz, who would be remembered in Fire Nation folklore as Taz the Terrible, represented the worst possibilities inherent in leadership, unconstrained by spiritual wisdom or moral principle, his reign demonstrating how quickly protective authority could transform into predatory tyranny when power became an end in itself rather than a means of serving larger purposes. His domain encompassed several of the larger fire islands, their populations subjugated through military force that was applied without regard for traditional concepts of honor or justice, their resources extracted through tribute systems that reduced entire communities to little more than sources of wealth for supporting his increasingly elaborate court and ever-expanding military ambitions. The annual tributes that Taz demanded from villages under his control were calculated not merely to generate revenue, but to demonstrate his absolute authority over every aspect of his subjects' lives. Their obligation to provide specific quantities of food, crafted goods, and precious materials serving as constant reminder that their continued existence depended entirely upon his temporary satisfaction with their compliance. The collection of these tributes was accompanied by ceremonies designed to emphasize the powerlessness of ordinary citizens and the futility of resistance against authority that possessed overwhelming military superiority and showed no inclination toward mercy or moderation in dealing with those who failed to meet his expectations. The villages that struggled to meet Taz's increasingly unreasonable demands faced consequences that went far beyond simple economic hardship to encompass systematic brutalization that seemed designed more to inspire terror than to serve any practical purpose. Communities that fell short of their tribute obligations were subjected to raids that destroyed property, scattered families, and eliminated local leadership that might have provided focus for organized resistance. These punitive expeditions were conducted with theatrical cruelty that ensured word of their devastation would spread throughout his domain, creating an atmosphere of fear that made most communities prefer the hardship of compliance to the horror of resistance. But it was in one particular village, whose name has been lost to history, but whose suffering would echo through the centuries in the form of spirits born from maternal anguish, that Taz's cruelty reached depths that violated fundamental laws governing the relationship between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. When this community proved unable to provide the tribute he demanded due to crop failures caused by volcanic activity beyond their control, Taz chose to make an example that would demonstrate the consequences of disappointing him, regardless of the circumstances that had made compliance impossible. The abduction of the village's children was carried out with military precision that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous punishment. His soldiers surrounding the settlement at dawn and systematically gathering every child between the ages of 5 and 15 before their parents could organize effective resistance or concealment. The operation was completed before most adults even understood what was happening, their children disappearing into Taz's encampment like offerings seized by some malevolent deity whose hunger could never be satisfied through voluntary sacrifice or negotiated compromise. The mothers whose children had been stolen experienced grief that transcended normal human emotional capacity, their anguish becoming so intense and all-consuming that it created spiritual resonances which began to attract attention from forces that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. Their nightly vigils searching for their missing children generated psychic energy that accumulated like static electricity before a storm, while their prayers for vengeance against those who had destroyed their families carried the kind of desperate intensity that could breach the barriers between different planes of reality. The transformation of these grieving mothers from living women into spirits of retribution occurred not through any conscious choice or deliberate ritual, but through the simple fact that their pain had become too great for mortal flesh to contain, their consciousness expanding beyond physical limitations, while their essential identity remained focused entirely on recovering their children and punishing those responsible for their loss. The Kemerikaje, as these spirits would become known throughout Fire Nation history, were born from love perverted into vengeance, maternal protection transformed into relentless pursuit of justice that recognized no obstacles and accepted no compromises. These newly manifested spirits possessed abilities that reflected both their origins as grieving mothers and their transformation into entities that operated according to different principles than those governing mortal existence. They could move through physical barriers as easily as walking through mist, their forms shifting between substantial presence and vaporous suggestion according to their emotional state and tactical requirements. Their voices carried the authority of absolute loss combined with absolute determination, their words capable of inspiring terror in the bravest warriors, while their appearance could freeze opponents with the kind of existential dread that arose from confronting suffering that had transcended all natural limitations. The haunting of Taz's regime began subtly, with sentries reporting glimpses of shadowy figures that vanished when approached directly, while the warlord's followers experienced nightmares that felt more real than their waking hours and seemed to continue even after they believed themselves to have awakened. The stolen children began disappearing from supposedly secure locations within the encampment, their absence discovered only when guards made their routine checks and found empty spaces where captives should have been securely restrained and carefully supervised. The psychological pressure that these manifestations created within Taz's organization proved more devastating than any military assault could have been, his followers' confidence in their leader's invincibility eroding as they realized that his power, however overwhelming it might be against mortal opposition, was useless against enemies who could not be killed because they were already dead. The desertion that began among his least committed supporters quickly spread to include veteran warriors who had served him faithfully for years but could not maintain their loyalty in the face of supernatural opposition that seemed to be systematically dismantling their leader's authority and effectiveness. The rescue of the abducted children was accomplished not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient infiltration that took advantage of the Camurricage's ability to move unseen through physical barriers and their intimate knowledge of their children's locations and conditions. One by one, the stolen youngsters were spirited away from their captivity and returned to their villages, their liberation accompanied by encounters with spirits that they recognized as their transformed mothers. Despite the radical changes that death and spiritual rebirth had produced in their appearance and essential nature, the collapse of Taz's regime came not through external conquest or internal rebellion, but through the simple fact that his followers gradually abandoned him as they realized that his authority extended only over the realm of the living and was powerless against forces that operated according to different rules than those governing mortal political relationships. His encampments emptied as warriors fled to seek service with leaders who faced only earthly opposition, while his administrative apparatus dissolved as officials concluded that loyalty to someone who could not protect them from supernatural vengeance was a luxury they could no longer afford. But the Camurricage did not simply disappear once their immediate purpose had been accomplished and their children had been safely returned to their communities. The transformation that had made them spirits of vengeance had also fundamentally altered their relationship to the physical world, making it impossible for them to resume their previous existence as living women, even though their specific grievance against Taz had been resolved through his downfall and the liberation of their offspring. Their continued presence in the world became a source of terror that extended far beyond their original target to encompass anyone whose actions might attract their attention and disapproval. The reign of terror that followed was not motivated by malice toward innocent people, but by the Camurricage's inability to distinguish between legitimate targets for their vengeance and ordinary individuals whose minor infractions or momentary lapses in judgment reminded them of the greater crimes they had been created to punish. Their pursuit of justice had become so absolute and uncompromising that it recognized no proportionality between offense and punishment, no mercy for human weakness, no recognition that perfect moral behavior was impossible for beings who remained subject to mortality and all the limitations that finite existence imposed upon consciousness. The other warlords, who controlled territory throughout the Fire Islands, found themselves facing opposition that could not be countered through conventional military strategies or political maneuvering, their authority undermined by the knowledge that supernatural forces were operating in their region, according to principles that made traditional concepts of power and influence meaningless. The competition between different factions that had previously been conducted through raids, sieges, and territorial negotiations was transformed into desperate cooperation aimed at addressing threats that endangered everyone, regardless of their political affiliations or territorial claims. The individual whose identity has been lost to history, but whose actions would reshape the entire political landscape of the Fire Islands, emerged from this crisis, not as a conqueror seeking to add the warlord's territories to his own domain, but as a mediator whose authority derived from his ability to communicate with the Camuricage and negotiate solutions that satisfied their demand for justice while protecting innocent people from punishment that exceeded any reasonable response to their actual transgressions. His success in bringing peace between the living and the dead established his reputation as someone whose wisdom transcended ordinary human capabilities. The process of bringing the surviving warlords to justice was conducted not through military conquest, but through spiritual trials that held leaders accountable for their actions, according to standards that reflected both human law and supernatural judgment. Those who had ruled with wisdom and compassion were allowed to maintain authority over their territories under the oversight of the unified government that was gradually taking shape, while those whose cruelty had earned them the Camuricage's attention were subjected to punishments that served both practical and spiritual purposes, their suffering providing satisfaction to wronged spirits while demonstrating to others the consequences of abusing power. The unification of the Fire Islands under single political authority represented revolutionary transformation in how governance was understood and implemented, the new system combining human administrative capabilities with spiritual oversight that ensured leaders remained accountable to principles that transcended immediate political considerations. The first Fire Lord, as this anonymous hero came to be known, established precedents for government that balanced practical necessity with moral obligation, creating institutions that could maintain order while respecting the rights and dignity of all citizens, regardless of their social position or economic status. The relationship between the new Fire Lord and the Fire Sages, who had maintained spiritual traditions throughout the period of warlord chaos, provided foundation for governance that integrated temporal and sacred authority in ways that had not been seen since the age of the Lion Turtle cities. These spiritual leaders brought knowledge of ancient practices and cosmic principles that could guide political decision-making toward outcomes that served long-term harmony rather than short-term advantage, while their connection to spiritual realms provided early warning of problems that purely mundane analysis might overlook until they had become critical. The descendants of the Sun Warriors, who had survived the warlord period by remaining hidden in remote mountain settlements, gradually emerged to share their preserved knowledge with the new unified government. Their advanced understanding of firebending techniques and spiritual principles providing resources that enabled rapid improvement in both military capabilities and cultural sophistication. Their integration into Fire Nation society brought legitimacy that connected the new political order to the ancient wisdom that had made the Fire Islands a center of learning and achievement, before warfare had temporarily disrupted such progress. The establishment of the Dragonbone Catacombs as both burial site for deceased Fire Lords and repository for the nation's historical records represented the new government's commitment to preserving knowledge and maintaining continuity across generations that might face very different challenges, but would need access to accumulated wisdom to make decisions that served their people's long-term welfare. The murals that began to cover the catacomb walls during this period were conceived not merely as decoration, but as permanent record of lessons learned through experience, their symbolic representations, conveying practical and spiritual insights that could guide future leaders facing similar situations. The split between the Fire Sage's spiritual authority and the Fire Lord's political power was accomplished through careful negotiation that preserved the essential functions of both institutions while preventing the conflicts that had plagued other societies where religious and temporal leaders competed for ultimate control. The sages retained responsibility for maintaining the nation's connection to cosmic forces and spiritual principles, while the Fire Lord assumed authority over practical governance and military affairs. Their cooperation, creating synthesis that combined wisdom with effectiveness in ways that served everyone's needs. The transformation of Fire Nation government from religious rule to autocratic empire reflected practical recognition that the challenges facing a unified nation required centralized decision-making authority that could respond quickly to threats and opportunities without being delayed by extended consultation processes that might serve spiritual purposes but could prove inadequate for addressing urgent temporal concerns. The concentration of power in the Fire Lord's hands was balanced by institutional requirements for regular communication with spiritual advisors and systematic consultation with regional leaders who understood local conditions and needs. The documentation of Fire Nation history that began during this period represented unprecedented commitment to preserving knowledge for future generations, while ensuring that lessons learned through hardship and sacrifice would not be forgotten when circumstances changed and new challenges required different approaches to governance and social organization. The scribes who worked in the Dragonbone catacombs understood their role as guardians of cultural memory, whose careful record-keeping could provide resources that would enable future leaders to avoid repeating past mistakes while building upon previous achievements. The scrolls that were placed alongside the murals contained detailed accounts of specific events and decisions that had shaped the nation's development. Their preservation, ensuring that future historians would have access to primary sources that could provide accurate understanding of how various policies had been implemented and what results had followed from different approaches to common problems. These written records complemented the visual narratives of the murals, while providing level of detail that artistic representation could not encompass within reasonable space limitations. The myths and legends that were also recorded during this period served different purposes than historical documentation, their symbolic narratives conveying spiritual and moral truths that transcended specific factual details, while providing cultural frameworks that could guide individual behavior and collective decision-making according to principles that had been proven through experience to promote harmony and prosperity. The preservation of these stories alongside factual records created comprehensive resource that addressed both practical and spiritual needs of future generations who would inherit responsibility for continuing the Fire Nation's development. As the first generation of unified Fire Nation governance established institutions and precedents that would influence the nation's trajectory for centuries to come, the foundation was being laid for everything that would follow in their history, from periods of unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement to darker eras when the wisdom that had guided their founders would be forgotten or deliberately abandoned in pursuit of power that served narrow interests rather than the greater good that had motivated the original unification of the Fire Islands under principled leadership that recognized its accountability to both human citizens and spiritual forces that transcended mortal understanding. In the centuries that followed the heroic unification of the Fire Islands under the first Fire Lord's wise and principled leadership, the newly formed Fire Nation discovered that creating a single political entity from previously independent territories was merely the beginning of challenges that would test every aspect of their governmental institutions and cultural identity. The complex web of relationships between different islands, noble clans, and regional authorities that had existed before unification could not simply be dissolved through political decree, but instead required patient negotiation and careful balance that acknowledged legitimate interests while building consensus around shared purposes that transcended local loyalties and ancient rivalries. The islands that comprised the Fire Nation had developed distinct identities over the generations of separation that preceded political unification, their cultures shaped by unique geographic conditions, economic specializations, and historical experiences that created perspectives and priorities which sometimes aligned with national interests, but often reflected concerns that were purely local in scope and immediate in urgency. The volcanic activity that affected different islands, according to varying patterns and intensities, had produced specialized knowledge and adaptive strategies that were valuable to their original communities, but difficult to share effectively across regions where such expertise was less relevant or applicable to local conditions. The autonomous governance structures that many islands had developed during the warlord period represented sophisticated responses to challenges that centralized authority could not address as effectively as local leadership that understood the specific requirements and limitations that geography and resources imposed upon their communities. The fishing villages that dotted coastal regions required different forms of organization than the mining settlements that had grown up around volcanic deposits, while the agricultural communities that flourished in fertile valleys operated according to seasonal rhythms that bore little resemblance to the concerns that motivated craftsmen in urban centers or traders who moved constantly between different markets. The fierce guardianship of resources that characterized relationships between different islands reflected practical recognition that survival often depended upon maintaining careful control over access to materials and knowledge that could, the difference between prosperity and catastrophe for communities that existed in delicate balance with environmental forces beyond their ability to predict or control completely. The volcanic soils that supported exceptional agriculture on some islands were jealously protected from exploitation by outsiders, while the mineral deposits that provided wealth for mining communities were defended against claims by central government authorities who might not understand the careful management required to maintain sustainable extraction over extended periods. The noble clans whose power had survived the transition from warlord rule to unified governance represented networks of family relationships, economic partnerships, and mutual defense agreements that had provided stability and security during periods when central authority was absent or ineffective. These organizations possessed their own military forces, accumulated wealth, and political influence that could not be ignored by fire lords who hoped to govern effectively, while their deep roots in local communities provided legitimacy that purely appointed officials could never match regardless of their competence or dedication to serving the national interest. The private armies that these noble clans maintained served multiple purposes that went beyond simple protection of family interests to encompass broader responsibilities for regional security and disaster response that central government forces might not be able to provide quickly or effectively. When crises arose without warning, these military units understood local terrain and conditions in ways that made them far more effective than outside forces for dealing with problems that required intimate knowledge of geographic features, weather patterns, and community relationships that could not be learned through formal study or brief periods of temporary assignment. The bloody feuds that regularly erupted between competing clans represented the dark side of this decentralized power structure, their conflicts consuming resources and energy that might otherwise have been devoted to constructive purposes while creating cycles of violence that could persist for generations. As each side sought to balance perceived wrongs with proportional retaliation. These disputes often began over matters that seemed trivial to outside observers, but carried symbolic significance that reflected fundamental questions about honor, respect, and the proper relationships between different social groups that possessed competing claims to authority and recognition. The binding of energy and resources in these feudal conflicts created drag on national development that prevented the Fire Nation from achieving its full potential, while directing creative and productive capabilities toward destruction, rather than construction of improvements that could have benefited everyone involved. The most talented warriors and strategists found their abilities consumed by local conflicts, rather than being available for projects that could have advanced the nation's overall prosperity and security. While communities lived in constant fear of becoming collateral damage in disputes that had nothing to do with their own interests or behavior, the Fire Nation government's own internal strife reflected the broader pattern of competition and conflict that characterized relationships throughout their society. As members of the royal family engaged in struggles for power that were often more intense and dangerous than the clan feuds that plagued their subjects. The concentration of ultimate authority in the Fire Lord's person created incentives for ambitious individuals to seek control over that position through whatever means proved necessary, while the lack of clear succession principles made every transition in leadership an opportunity for civil war that could devastate the entire nation. The conspiracies that flourished within the royal court were products of both opportunity and necessity, as family members who possessed legitimate claims to leadership found themselves forced to choose between accepting subordinate roles that might prove temporary and actively pursuing power that could provide security for themselves, their supporters. The palace intrigues that resulted from these calculations created atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that made effective governance increasingly difficult, as leaders spent more energy protecting themselves from internal threats than addressing external challenges that required their attention and resources. The recurring civil wars that plagued the Fire Nation during certain periods were often triggered by disputes over succession rights or policy disagreements that could not be resolved through normal political processes, their destructive effects extending far beyond the immediate participants to encompass entire regions that became battlegrounds for competing claims to legitimate authority. These conflicts demonstrated the fundamental weakness in governmental systems that concentrated too much power in individual positions, while failing to provide adequate mechanisms for peaceful resolution of disputes that inevitably arose when different groups possessed conflicting interests and incompatible visions for their society's future development. The issues that sparked these civil wars were often relatively minor when viewed objectively, their significance magnified by symbolic implications and personal grievances that transformed practical disagreements into existential conflicts where compromise became impossible and victory could only be achieved through the complete destruction of opposing forces. The accumulation of past injustices and unresolved resentments created explosive potential that could be triggered by events that might otherwise have been addressed through negotiation and mutual accommodation rather than military confrontation. Despite the chronic instability that these internal conflicts created, the Fire Nation's urbanization and cultivation continued to progress steadily, as the underlying economic and technological forces that drove development proved stronger than the political disruptions that periodically interrupted their advancement. The cities that grew up around major ports and industrial centers provided stability and continuity that transcended changes in political leadership, while their prosperity created incentives for maintaining peace that gradually outweighed the attractions of military adventure and territorial conquest that had previously motivated much of the violence between different factions. The Fozel dynasty that emerged from one of these succession struggles proved particularly effective at promoting domestic development, while managing the complex relationships between central authority and regional autonomy that had frustrated previous rulers who had attempted to govern through either excessive centralization or inadequate coordination between different levels of government. Their policies emphasized practical cooperation rather than theoretical unity, creating frameworks that allowed different groups to pursue their own interests while contributing to shared objectives that benefited everyone involved. The domestication of Komodo rhinos during this period represented exactly the kind of practical innovation that could emerge when communities were allowed sufficient autonomy to experiment with solutions to local problems, while maintaining connections to broader networks that could share successful techniques and technologies across the entire nation. These magnificent creatures, whose size and strength made them ideal beasts of burden for the volcanic terrain and heavy materials that characterized much of Fire Nation agriculture and construction, required careful breeding and training that drew upon knowledge accumulated over generations of patient observation and experimentation. The Komodo rhinos' integration into Fire Nation society transformed transportation, construction, and military capabilities in ways that enabled achievements that would have been impossible without their contribution. Their ability to carry heavy loads across difficult terrain while maintaining stability under challenging conditions, making them invaluable partners for communities that needed to move materials and supplies across islands where conventional wheeled vehicles would have been ineffective or completely impractical for regular use. The role that these creatures played in Fire Nation development extended beyond mere practical utility to encompass cultural and symbolic significance that reflected the nation's evolving relationship with the natural world and their profound, growing understanding of how cooperation with other species could multiply human capabilities while maintaining harmony with environmental systems that supported all life within their territory. The care and respect that Komodo rhino handlers showed toward their animal partners demonstrated values that balanced pragmatic efficiency with ethical consideration for the welfare of beings whose service made human achievements possible. The military applications of Komodo rhinos provided Fire Nation forces with tactical advantages that would prove crucial during periods when external threats required defensive responses or when internal conflicts made mobility and logistics particularly important for determining the outcome of campaigns that might otherwise have been decided through simple numerical superiority or superior individual combat skills. The cavalry units that developed around these creatures combined speed and power in ways that made them formidable opponents, while their defensive capabilities provided protection for supply lines and communication networks that were essential for maintaining coordination during extended operations. The continued development of military contingency plans during periods of relative peace demonstrated the Fire Nation leadership's growing sophistication in strategic thinking and their recognition that effective defense required preparation that began long before specific threats materialized into immediate dangers. The planning processes that were established during the 4th century before the Great Comet addressed scenarios ranging from internal civil wars to invasions by Earth Kingdom or Water Tribe forces, their comprehensive scope reflecting understanding that future conflicts might take forms that had not been previously experienced or anticipated. The Civil War contingencies that were developed during this period acknowledged the reality that internal conflicts remained a constant possibility despite the institutional reforms that had been implemented to reduce their likelihood. Their detailed provisions for maintaining essential services and protecting civilian populations, showing that military planners understood their responsibility to minimize the damage that political disputes could inflict upon innocent people who had no control over the decisions that created such crisis. The invasion scenarios that were considered reflected growing awareness that the Fire Nation's increasing prosperity and technological advancement might eventually attract aggressive attention from neighbors who possessed both the capability and motivation to attempt conquest of territories that offered significant strategic and economic advantages. The defensive plans that were created to address such possibilities combined traditional military tactics with innovative approaches that took advantage of the Fire Nation's unique geographic features and technological capabilities, while acknowledging the limitations that island geography imposed upon their ability to project power beyond their own borders. The Earth Kingdom invasion plans that were developed during this period represented offensive capabilities that could be employed if diplomatic solutions proved inadequate for resolving conflicts that threatened Fire Nation interests or security, their existence serving both as deterrent to potential aggression and as practical preparation for scenarios where military action might become necessary to protect legitimate national interests that could not be safeguarded through purely defensive measures. The Water Tribe invasion scenarios that were considered reflected recognition that these societies possessed unique capabilities and resources that could pose significant challenges to Fire Nation's security if they chose to align themselves with hostile forces or if internal developments within their territories created threats that required preemptive response to prevent more serious problems from developing over time into situations that would be much more difficult and costly to address through military intervention. The noble clans that continued to maintain their feuds and pursue their individual ambitions despite the national government's efforts to channel their energies toward more constructive purposes, represented both the greatest strength and the most serious weakness of Fire Nation society, their independent capabilities, providing resources and resilience that centralized authority could never match, while their competitive conflicts created vulnerabilities that external enemies might exploit if they understood the internal dynamics that shaped Fire Nation politics and social organization. The hope that some noble clans harbored for eventually taking control of the central government itself reflected their recognition that political power at the national level offered opportunities for advancing their interests that could not be achieved through purely regional authority, while their confidence in their own capabilities suggested that they possessed realistic assessments of their strengths relative to the royal family and other competing factions whose claims to leadership might be challenged through skillful political maneuvering or military action if circumstances provided favorable opportunities. As the Fire Nation approached the era of Avatar Kyoshi and the events that would reshape their internal political relationships while establishing their position as a major force in international affairs, the foundations had been laid for both the achievements and the conflicts that would define their role in world history for centuries to come. Their internal strength and technological capabilities balanced by institutional weaknesses and cultural tensions that would influence every aspect of their future development and determine whether their growing power would be used for constructive or destructive purposes in the broader context of global politics and spiritual balance. In the year 295 before the Great Comet, when the Fire Nation had achieved unprecedented prosperity through centuries of careful political consolidation and technological advancement, Fire Lord Zoryu extended an invitation that would reshape not only his nation's internal power structures, but also establish precedents for international cooperation and conflict resolution that would influence global politics for generations to come. The invitation to Avatar Kyoshi to celebrate the festival of Sheto represented both diplomatic courtesy and strategic calculation, as the young Fire Lord recognized that his ambitious plans for domestic reform would require legitimacy that only Avatar endorsement could provide in a world where spiritual authority still carried weight that purely temporal power could never match. The Festival of Seto itself held profound significance within Fire Nation culture, commemorating not merely a historical avatar, but the principles of balanced governance and spiritual wisdom that had guided the nation during some of its most challenging and transformative periods. Avatar Seto's legacy in the Fire Nation was unique among all previous incarnations. His direct involvement in political administration and economic development, having created precedents for Avatar participation in mundane governance that other nations had never experienced or fully understood in terms of their long-term implications for the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. The celebration that Fire Lord Zoryu planned was designed to demonstrate his nation's respect for Avatar traditions, while simultaneously showcasing the Fire Nation's achievements in art, architecture, technology, and social organization that had elevated them above their neighbors in terms of prosperity, military capability, and cultural sophistication. The festivals and ceremonies that would accompany Kyoshi's visit were intended to create an atmosphere of mutual respect and cooperation that could provide foundation for the political changes that Zoryu believed were necessary to ensure his nation's continued development and security in an increasingly complex international environment. But the Avatar who arrived in response to Zoryu's invitation was unlike any previous incarnation in terms of her approach to political problems and her willingness to use decisive action rather than patient negotiation when circumstances demanded immediate resolution of conflicts that threatened innocent lives. Kyoshi's reputation had been established through her confrontations with various tyrants and criminals who had terrorized their communities, while conventional authorities proved inadequate to address threats that required both spiritual power and practical wisdom to resolve effectively and permanently. The events that unfolded during and after Kyoshi's visit to the Fire Nation would later be known as the Camellia Peony War. Though the name itself reflected only the surface appearances of conflicts that actually involved fundamental questions about the nature of political authority, the relationship between central government and regional autonomy, and the proper role of noble families whose traditional privileges and independent power bases were increasingly incompatible with the kind of unified national administration that modern challenges seem to require. The war itself was sparked by incidents that might have been resolved through normal diplomatic channels if the underlying tensions between different factions had not reached levels that made compromise impossible and violence inevitable, regardless of the specific triggers that provided justification for military action. The noble clans whose authority Fire Lord Zoryu sought to curtail had recognized that their traditional way of life was under systematic attack through policies that appeared reasonable and moderate on the surface, but would eventually eliminate their independent capacity to protect their interests and maintain their cultural identity. Avatar Kyoshi's involvement in these conflicts was decisive in ways that went far beyond simple military intervention, her actions demonstrating both the power that Avatar authority could wield when applied directly to political problems and the wisdom required to use such power in ways that served long-term stability rather than merely resolving immediate crises through overwhelming force that might create new problems while addressing current ones. The resolution of the Camellia Peony War established principles that would guide Fire Nation internal politics for the next 2 centuries, creating frameworks for managing the relationship between central authority and regional autonomy that acknowledged legitimate interests on all sides, while preventing the kind of destructive conflicts that had previously consumed energy and resources that could have been devoted to constructive purposes The compromise that Kyoshi helped negotiate preserved essential features of the traditional system, while adapting them to serve the needs of unified national governance that could respond effectively to challenges that purely local authority could never address adequately. But Fire Lord Zoryu's satisfaction with the war's outcome was tempered by his recognition that the victory had been incomplete, that the noble clans retained enough independent power to threaten future stability if their opposition to central authority was allowed to build over time into organized resistance that could exploit moments of weakness or distraction to reassert their traditional privileges and autonomous governance structures. His resolve to break the strength of the noble clans permanently was born not from personal ambition or desire for absolute power, but from practical understanding that divided authority would always create vulnerabilities that internal enemies or external threats could exploit to devastating effect. The generational project that Zoryu initiated was unprecedented in its scope and ambition, requiring systematic transformation of social, economic, and political relationships that had developed over centuries, and was supported by networks of personal loyalty, family obligation, and cultural tradition that could not be changed through simple legislative decree or military intimidation. The gradual erosion of noble clan power would require patient work that extended far beyond any single ruler's lifetime, demanding consistency of purpose and strategic vision that could be maintained across multiple generations of leadership, who might face very different challenges but would need to continue pursuing the same fundamental objectives. The policies that Zoryu established to advance this generational project were carefully designed to avoid provoking the kind of desperate resistance that could unite the noble clans in common cause against central authority, their implementation proceeding slowly enough to allow adaptation while maintaining sufficient pressure to prevent consolidation of opposition that could reverse the progress that had been achieved. The approach combined incentives that made cooperation more attractive than resistance, with consequences that made rebellion increasingly costly, while offering alternatives that preserved dignity and opportunity for those willing to accept, reduced autonomy in exchange for enhanced security and prosperity. The loyalty that Zoryu sought to build was not based on fear or simple self-interest, but on genuine appreciation for the benefits that effective central government could provide when it operated according to principles that served the play's common good rather than narrow factional interests. The citizens who gradually shifted their primary allegiance from local noble families to the Fire Lord personally were responding to evidence that unified national authority could protect and advance their welfare more effectively than the traditional system of competing regional powers whose conflicts often made ordinary people victims rather than beneficiaries of political competition. The descendants who would continue Zoryu's policies inherited not only his strategic vision, but also the institutional mechanisms and cultural precedents that made further progress towards centralized authority possible without requiring the kind of revolutionary upheaval that could have destroyed the very prosperity and stability that their efforts were intended to preserve and enhance. Each successive Fire Lord built upon his predecessor's achievements, while adapting to changing circumstances that required different tactics, while pursuing the same fundamental objectives that Zoryu had established as necessary for Fire Nation security and development. The royal family's control over the Fire Nation that gradually emerged from this systematic effort represented a fundamental transformation in how political power was understood and exercised. The Fire Lords becoming not merely first among equals within a system of competing authorities, but genuine autocrats whose word carried absolute force throughout their domain, while their subjects accepted such concentration of power as natural and beneficial, rather than oppressive or illegitimate. The process by which this transformation was accomplished avoided the bloodshed and chaos that usually accompanied such dramatic changes in governmental structure. Its success depending upon the patience and wisdom of leaders who understood that lasting change required consent rather than merely compliance from those whose lives were being reshaped. The Fire Lords, who amassed increasing power during the 2 centuries following the Camellia Peony War, did so within frameworks that balanced absolute authority with moral obligation. Their control over their subjects accompanied by responsibility for their welfare that created incentives for just and effective governance, while providing standards against which their performance could be evaluated by those whose consent ultimately legitimized their rule. The autocracy that eventually emerged was benevolent and competent rather than merely powerful, its acceptance by Fire Nation citizens reflecting their recognition that centralized authority served their interests better than any alternative system they had experienced or could imagine. The contrast between Fire Nation development and the Earth Kingdom's decline during the same period demonstrated the advantages that effective centralized governance could provide when it operated according to sound principles while avoiding the corruption and incompetence that had plagued other nations whose political systems proved inadequate for addressing the challenges that modernization and international competition created. The Earth Kingdom's struggles with internal division and regional autonomy that prevented coordinated response to common problems served as cautionary example of what could happen when traditional authority structures were maintained past the point where they could serve their intended purposes effectively. The War of Qin the Conqueror that had devastated much of the Earth Kingdom while leaving the Fire Nation largely unaffected illustrated the security advantages that unified command structure could provide when external threats required rapid mobilization of resources and coordinated strategic response that decentralized systems could not achieve quickly enough to prevent catastrophic damage to their territories and populations. The Fire Nation's ability to avoid involvement in conflicts that did not directly threaten their interests while maintaining defensive preparations that deterred potential aggression demonstrated the practical benefits of political consolidation that their patient generational project had achieved. The era of great prosperity and modernization that characterized Fire Nation development during this period was built upon foundations of political stability and social cooperation that enabled resources to be devoted to productive rather than destructive purposes. Their citizens' energy and creativity channeled toward innovations and improvements that benefited everyone, rather than being consumed by factional conflicts that served no constructive purpose while preventing progress towards shared goals that could have advanced their collective welfare and security. The technological advancement that made the Fire Nation the most advanced country in the world emerged from social conditions that encouraged experimentation and rewarded achievement while providing stability that allowed long-term projects to be completed without interruption from political upheavals or military conflicts that could have disrupted the careful accumulation of knowledge and capability that such progress required. The Industrial Revolution that began in the Fire Nation spread throughout the world precisely because their internal development had created capacity for innovation that other nations could not match, despite possessing similar natural resources and human potential. The excellence in trade and commerce that characterized Fire Nation economic development reflected both their technological advantages and their political stability that made them reliable partners for international business relationships, while their internal market provided demand for goods and services that could support specialized production and sophisticated financial arrangements. The prosperity that resulted from these commercial relationships created additional resources that could be invested in further development, while providing incentives for maintaining the peaceful international relationships that made such trade possible and profitable for all participants. The powerful military that the Fire Nation maintained during this period was both product and guarantor of their internal stability and external security, their defensive capabilities providing protection that enabled civilian economic activity to flourish, while their reputation for military competence deterred potential aggression that might otherwise have disrupted the peaceful conditions that their prosperity required. The balance between military strength and diplomatic engagement that characterized their international relations during this golden age would provide precedents and capabilities that would later be perverted into instruments of conquest, when different leaders with different values assumed control over the same institutions and resources. The births of Avatar Roku and Crown Prince Sozin into this time of unprecedented progress and prosperity positioned them to inherit a Fire Nation that had achieved everything that Zoryu's generational project had envisioned, their childhood experiences shaped by conditions that seemed to validate the wisdom of centralized authority, while providing resources and opportunities that enabled them to develop their individual capabilities to the fullest extent possible. The friendship that developed between the Avatar and the future Fire Lord reflected the harmony between spiritual and temporal authority that had characterized the best periods of Fire Nation history, their personal bond symbolizing the cooperation that had made their nation's achievements possible. Avatar Roku's development as a force for balance and peace in the world was supported by his early exposure to effective governance and prosperous society that demonstrated the possibilities for human achievement when political systems operated according to just principles, while maintaining the stability that allowed creativity and productivity to flourish without interference from destructive conflicts or oppressive policies. His understanding of what good government could accomplish would influence his approach to international mediation and conflict resolution throughout his lifetime as Avatar, his personal experience of beneficial authority providing standards against which he could evaluate other systems and leaders. Crown Prince Sozin's belief that the Fire Nation's prosperity should be shared with the rest of the world reflected both generous impulses and the confidence that came from belonging to a society that had successfully solved problems that continued to plague their neighbors. His conviction that Fire Nation methods and institutions could benefit other peoples arising from genuine observation of his nation's achievements rather than mere cultural chauvinism or desire for personal aggrandizement. The dreams of global empire that would eventually corrupt his noble intentions were rooted in experiences that seemed to validate the superiority of Fire Nation approaches to governance, economics, and social organization. The ambitions that led Sozin to initiate military reforms and territorial expansion represented the dark potential that had always existed within the centralized authority that Zoryu's project had created. The concentration of power that had served beneficial purposes under wise leadership becoming instrument of oppression and conquest when different values and objectives guided its application. The military capabilities and political institutions that had been developed to serve defensive purposes and promote internal harmony could be redirected toward aggressive goals without requiring fundamental changes in their structure or operation. Their effectiveness in serving destructive purposes, matching their previous success in advancing constructive ones. As the golden age of Fire Nation internal development approached its end with the emergence of imperial ambitions that would transform the nation from model of effective governance into threat to world peace and stability, the foundations that had been laid during 2 centuries of patient political consolidation would prove capable of supporting either the greatest achievements or the most terrible crimes that human civilization had ever produced, their ultimate direction depending entirely upon the wisdom and character of leaders. who would inherit unprecedented power, along with the responsibility to use it in ways that honored the sacrifices and preserved the achievements of all, those who had worked to create the prosperity and capability that could serve either creation or destruction with equal effectiveness. The childhood friendship that blossomed between Avatar Roku and Crown Prince Sozin during the golden years of Fire Nation prosperity was forged in the kind of innocent camaraderie that only children who have never known true hardship or genuine loss can experience. Their bond, strengthened by shared adventures through palace gardens and mountain temples where the weight of cosmic responsibility and political authority remained distant abstractions rather than immediate realities that would soon reshape every aspect of their existence. The two boys explored their world with the fearless curiosity that comes from growing up in circumstances where safety and security were taken for granted, their games and competitions reflecting the confidence of young minds that had never encountered problems that could not be solved through intelligence, determination, and the resources that unlimited privilege could provide. The Fire Nation that nurtured their friendship had achieved levels of prosperity and technological sophistication that made their homeland seem almost magical compared to the conditions that prevailed in neighboring regions. Their cities gleaming with architectural marvels that combined aesthetic beauty with practical efficiency, while their countryside flourished under agricultural techniques and industrial processes that had transformed volcanic islands into gardens of abundance, where scarcity seemed like a distant memory from primitive times that enlightened civilization had permanently transcended. The steamships that moved through their harbors, the factories that produced goods of unprecedented quality and complexity, the roads that connected previously isolated communities into networks of commerce and communication, all testified to human capabilities that had been developed and refined through generations of peaceful progress. The educational opportunities that both boys enjoyed reflected their society's commitment to developing individual potential without regard for traditional limitations that might have prevented less privileged children from achieving their full capabilities, their tutors and instructors representing the finest scholarly traditions from across the known world, while their practical training encompassed everything from martial arts and military strategy to philosophy and spiritual meditation that prepared them for leadership roles that would require wisdom as well as power, understanding as well as authority, compassion as well as strength to discharge their responsibilities effectively and justly. Roku's development as the Avatar was guided by teachers who understood that his cosmic role required balance between spiritual insight and practical knowledge, his education emphasizing the interconnectedness of all existence while providing concrete skills for addressing specific problems that would arise during his lifetime as the bridge between worlds. The firebending techniques that he mastered went beyond mere elemental manipulation to encompass understanding of fire's role in maintaining the harmony that connected all life, while his studies in other elements prepared him to appreciate perspectives and approaches that his own cultural background might not have provided without such comprehensive exposure to different ways of understanding reality. Sozin's preparation for eventual rule as Fire Lord combined traditional instruction in statecraft and military affairs with exposure to philosophical principles and ethical frameworks that were intended to ensure that his exercise of power would serve the greater good rather than merely advancing personal or factional interests. The administrative complexities that he learned to navigate during carefully supervised involvement in governmental decision-making provided practical experience in balancing competing demands and conflicting priorities while maintaining focus on long-term objectives that transcended immediate political pressures. and temporary advantages that might compromise fundamental principles. The friendship between the future Avatar and the future Fire Lord was celebrated throughout Fire Nation society as symbol of the harmony that could exist between spiritual and temporal authority when both were exercised according to Fire Nation principles that recognized their mutual dependence and complementary purposes. Their public appearances together at festivals and ceremonies demonstrated the unity of purpose that had made the Fire Nation's achievements possible, while providing inspiration for citizens who saw in their relationship proof that power and wisdom could support rather than threaten each other, when wielded by individuals of good character and noble intention. But as both young men matured and began to assume the responsibilities that their destinies demanded, subtle differences in their fundamental approaches to leadership and their understanding of how their capabilities should be employed began to create tensions that would eventually transform their friendship into the tragic opposition that would define the final years of the Golden Age and usher in the dark century of war that would follow Roku's death. The Avatar's commitment to maintaining balance between all nations and peoples required him to consider the welfare of everyone equally, while the Fire Lord's primary obligation to his own people created incentives for policies that might serve Fire Nation interests, even if they came at some cost to other societies. Sozin's belief that Fire Nation prosperity should be shared with the rest of the world emerged from genuine observation of the suffering and hardship that characterized life in regions where effective governance, advanced technology, and social harmony had not been achieved through the patient work that had transformed his homeland from collection of warring islands into unified nation capable of providing security and opportunity for all its citizens. The contrast between Fire Nation achievements and the conditions that prevailed elsewhere seemed to demonstrate that his people possessed knowledge and capabilities that could benefit everyone if properly applied through systematic expansion of their influence and control. The dreams of global empire that began to occupy Sozin's imagination were initially motivated by altruistic desires to extend the blessings of Fire Nation civilization to peoples who remained trapped in poverty, ignorance, and conflict through no fault of their own, but simply because they had not yet discovered the principles of governance and social organization that had enabled such remarkable progress in his homeland. The vision that inspired his early planning portrayed Fire Nation expansion not as conquest but as liberation, not as exploitation but as development, not as oppression but as education, that would eventually enable all peoples to achieve similar levels of prosperity and happiness. But the implementation of these noble ideals required military capabilities and administrative structures that could impose Fire Nation systems upon societies that might not immediately recognize their benefits or willingly abandon traditional ways of life that had provided identity and meaning, even if they had not delivered material prosperity or political stability. The reforms that Sozin initiated to prepare his nation for its global mission were presented as temporary measures necessary to overcome resistance that arose from ignorance or misguided attachment to inferior approaches rather than fundamental opposition to principles that any rational person would eventually accept once their advantages became apparent through experience. The militarization of Fire Nation society that resulted from these preparations was justified through arguments that emphasized the defensive necessity of being prepared to protect peaceful civilians from violent opposition, while humanitarian objectives were being pursued through patient persuasion and practical demonstration. The expansion of military forces and development of new weapons technologies were portrayed as unfortunate requirements imposed by the aggression and unreasonable hostility of peoples who preferred warfare to cooperation, conflict to harmony, isolation to the beneficial integration that Fire Nation leadership could provide, if given opportunity to demonstrate its effectiveness. The spiritual decline that accompanied this military buildup was more subtle, but ultimately more corrosive than the obvious changes in political priorities and resource allocation that transformed Fire Nation society from peaceful prosperity to aggressive expansionism. The respect for life that had been central to Fire Nation culture during its golden age was gradually eroded by ideologies that emphasized the greater good that justified temporary harm to individuals who opposed progress toward universal benefits that their sacrifice would make possible for future generations who would understand and appreciate what had been accomplished on their behalf. The near extinction of dragons that occurred during this period represented one of the most tragic consequences of the spiritual corruption that accompanied Sozin's military preparations. These magnificent beings whose wisdom had guided human development for millennia, becoming targets for hunting and exploitation, that treated them as sources of power to be harvested, rather than teachers to be honored and protected. The knowledge that died with each dragon represented irreplaceable loss of understanding about the true nature of firebending and its proper relationship to cosmic forces that maintained harmony throughout the natural world. The brutalization of Agni Kai traditions that had previously served as ritualized method for resolving conflicts through honorable combat between individuals was transformed into entertainment and political tool that emphasized domination and humiliation rather than mutual respect and principled resolution of genuine disagreements. The sacred nature of these encounters was corrupted by their use as public spectacles designed to reinforce hierarchies and demonstrate consequences for challenging authority rather than providing fair opportunities for justice and public spectacles designed vindication of legitimate grievances. The establishment of Fire Nation colonies in the Earth Kingdom represented the first practical implementation of Sozin's vision for sharing his nation's prosperity with other peoples. These settlements, serving as demonstration projects that were intended to show how Fire Nation administration and technology could transform barren or underutilized territories into thriving communities that provided better lives for everyone involved, while generating resources that could support further expansion of beneficial influence throughout the world. The colonists who participated in these early ventures were motivated by genuine desire to improve conditions for Earth Kingdom residents, as well as opportunities for personal advancement and service to their nation. The industrial centers that these colonies became reflected Fire Nation expertise in organizing production and managing resources that could create wealth and employment while providing goods and services that improved living standards for local populations who had previously struggled with subsistence-level existence under traditional Earth Kingdom governance that lacked both capability and commitment necessary for systematic development. The success of these early colonial ventures seemed to validate Sozin's theories about the benefits that Fire Nation expansion could provide, while demonstrating that resistance to such beneficial changes was both irrational and counterproductive. Avatar Roku's growing concern about these developments reflected his understanding of balance and his recognition that even beneficial changes could become dangerous when they proceeded without adequate consideration for the autonomy and cultural integrity of peoples whose lives were being transformed according to external priorities and foreign values. The Avatar's responsibility to maintain harmony between nations required him to consider not only immediate material improvements, but also long-term spiritual and cultural consequences that might not become apparent until irreversible damage had been done to essential aspects of human diversity and local wisdom. The intervention that Roku eventually felt compelled to make represented direct challenge to his childhood friend's vision and policies. their personal relationship becoming casualty of cosmic responsibilities that could not be subordinated to individual loyalty or sentimental attachment to memories of simpler times when their dreams and goals had been compatible rather than fundamentally opposed. The confrontation between Avatar and Fire Lord was painful for both participants, their shared history making it impossible to treat their conflict as merely political disagreement between leaders representing different interests and perspectives. Sozin's expansionism was finally stopped by Roku's intervention, not through military defeat or diplomatic pressure, but through spiritual authority that commanded respect, even from someone whose commitment to his own vision had been strengthened by years of apparent success and validation, from supporters who shared his conviction that Fire Nation methods represented clear improvement over alternative approaches to governance and social organization. The compromise that allowed Fire Nation colonists to remain in Earth Kingdom territory while preventing further expansion represented an attempt to balance competing principles and interests that satisfied no one completely while averting immediate crisis. The years that followed this confrontation were marked by superficial compliance with Avatar authority, combined with continued preparation for renewed expansion that would resume when circumstances permitted. Sozin's acceptance of Roku's limitations, reflecting tactical considerations rather than genuine change in his fundamental beliefs about Fire Nation destiny and responsibility to share their achievements with less advanced peoples, who needed guidance and assistance to achieve their full potential. The peace that prevailed during the remainder of Roku's lifetime was maintained through mutual recognition of power rather than genuine resolution of underlying philosophical differences. The friendship that had once symbolized harmony between spiritual and temporal authority became source of private anguish for both men, their personal affection surviving despite their public opposition, while their shared memories of childhood adventures and youthful idealism provided painful contrast to the bitter realities of adult responsibility and conflicting duty that made reconciliation impossible without betrayal of principles that neither could abandon without losing essential aspects of their identity and purpose. Roku's role as Avatar required him to serve as force for balance and peace throughout the world, his cosmic responsibilities taking precedence over personal relationships and national loyalties when these came into conflict with universal principles that governed the relationship between spiritual and material realms. The position that he was forced to take regarding Fire Nation expansion reflected not hostility toward his homeland or lack of appreciation for their achievements, but recognition that even beneficial changes could become destructive when they proceeded without adequate respect for the autonomy and dignity of peoples whose consent had not been obtained through genuinely free choice. Sozin's commitment to sharing Fire Nation prosperity with other peoples remained sincere, even as the methods required for implementing his vision became increasingly coercive, and the resistance he encountered strengthened his conviction that opposition to clearly beneficial changes could only arise from ignorance, irrationality, or selfish attachment to inferior systems that serve narrow interests rather than the greater good that Fire Nation leadership could provide. The contradiction between his noble intentions and the harsh realities of imposing them upon unwilling recipients was rationalized through theories that emphasized long-term benefits that would eventually justify temporary hardships imposed upon people who lacked sufficient wisdom to understand what was being offered to them. The seeds of the 100-Year War that would follow Roku's death were planted during this period of superficial peace, the preparations for renewed expansion continuing beneath surface compliance with Avatar authority, while ideological justifications for conquest were refined, and military capabilities were enhanced in anticipation of opportunities that would arise when spiritual opposition was no longer present to constrain the implementation of policies that served humanitarian objectives regardless of their immediate appearance to observers, who failed to appreciate their ultimate purpose and inevitable beneficial consequences. As the golden age of Fire Nation civilization approached its end with the death of Avatar Roku and the return of Sozin's comet that would provide enhanced firebending power necessary for implementing the final solution to global problems that had resisted peaceful resolution, the transformation of the most advanced and prosperous nation in the world into the greatest threat to international peace and spiritual balance was nearly complete, their capabilities and institutions remaining essentially unchanged, while their leadership's vision had evolved from enlightened governance to imperial ambition that would bring suffering to millions, while ultimately destroying the very prosperity and harmony that had made their achievements possible during the centuries when wisdom rather than power had guided their development and defined their relationships with neighboring peoples and cosmic forces. The arrival of Sozin's comet in the year 12, before the great divide that would forever separate the world into an age of war, cast an ominous crimson glow across skies that had known peace for generations, its celestial fire promising to enhance firebending abilities beyond anything that had been experienced since the previous passage of this cosmic phenomenon a century earlier. Fire Lord Sozin, now aged and driven by decades of frustrated ambition that had been constrained by Avatar Roku's intervention and the spiritual authority that had prevented the implementation of his vision for global Fire Nation leadership, saw in the comet's return the opportunity he had been preparing for throughout the years of enforced patience and superficial compliance with limitations that had never diminished his fundamental conviction about his nation's destiny and responsibility. The air nomad genocide that Sozin launched with the comet's enhancement represented the most calculated and systematic destruction of an entire civilization that the world had ever witnessed, its planning reflecting not spontaneous violence or military opportunism but deliberate strategy designed to eliminate forever the possibility that a new avatar could emerge from the nomadic peoples whose spiritual traditions and philosophical commitment to balance posed the greatest threat to Fire Nation imperial ambitions. The attack was coordinated across all 4 air temples simultaneously, ensuring that no sanctuary could provide refuge and no survivors could carry warning to potential defenders who might have organized resistance if they had understood the scope and determination of the forces arrayed against them. The complete annihilation of air nomad civilization that followed was accomplished through military precision that left no room for mercy or hesitation. Sozin's forces having been prepared through years of indoctrination that portrayed their targets not as innocent civilians but as obstacles to global progress whose elimination was necessary for the greater good of humanity as a whole. The monks and children who died in the temples that had served as centers of learning and spiritual development for centuries were killed not through personal hatred but through ideological conviction that their continued existence was incompatible with the unified world order that Fire Nation leadership could provide if freed from the interference of Avatar authority and spiritual opposition. The spiritual devastation that accompanied this physical destruction extended far beyond the immediate loss of life to encompass the obliteration of knowledge, traditions, and ways of understanding the world that had developed over millennia and could never be recovered or reconstructed once their living repositories had been eliminated. The libraries that burned, the artwork that was destroyed, the oral traditions that died with their last practitioners represented irreplaceable loss of human wisdom and cultural diversity that made the world itself poorer and less capable of addressing future challenges that might require precisely the kinds of insight and approach that the air nomads had, preserved and refined through generations of patient observation and spiritual practice. The search for Avatar Aang, that consumed enormous resources and attention throughout the early years of the war, reflected Sozin's understanding that his strategy for preventing the Avatar cycle from continuing had failed in its most crucial objective, the young airbender's mysterious disappearance, creating uncertainty that threatened to undermine everything the genocide had been intended to accomplish. The possibility that the Avatar remained alive somewhere in the world meant that the spiritual opposition to Fire Nation expansion could eventually resurface with power, enhanced by righteous anger over the crimes that had been committed against his people, making the elimination of this remaining threat essential for the long-term security of everything Sozin hoped to achieve. The military campaigns that spread Fire Nation control across northwestern territories of the Earth Kingdom proceeded with the systematic efficiency that had characterized the air nomad assault, their success reflecting both the enhanced abilities that the comet had provided and the careful preparation that had been conducted during the years when open expansion had been prevented by Avatar Roku's intervention. The Earth Kingdom forces that attempted to resist these invasions discovered that their traditional defensive strategies and fortifications were inadequate against opponents whose firebending had been amplified beyond normal levels, while their military organization and technological advantages provided coordination and capability that overwhelmed regional defenses that had been designed to address more conventional threats. The conquest of territory was accompanied by immediate implementation of administrative and economic systems that transformed occupied regions into sources of wealth and resources that could support further expansion, while demonstrating to local populations the practical benefits that Fire Nation rule could provide when resistance was abandoned in favor of cooperation with obviously superior governance and social organization. The colonists who followed military forces into conquered territories brought with them knowledge and techniques that could improve living conditions for everyone willing to accept the changes that integration into Fire Nation civilization required, while providing opportunities for advancement that had never existed under previous Earth Kingdom administration. The historical revisionism that Sozin initiated through sealing the Dragonbone catacombs represented systematic attempt to control not only the present and future, but also the past, ensuring that subsequent generations would understand their nation's history according to narratives that justified and glorified the imperial expansion, while eliminating access to information that might provide alternative perspectives or raise uncomfortable questions about the methods that had been employed to achieve their dominance. The corridors that had once preserved comprehensive records of Fire Nation development from its earliest origins were locked away from public access, their contents becoming state secrets that only authorized officials could examine under carefully controlled circumstances. The appearance that Fire Nation history began with Sozin's reign was created through careful manipulation of available sources and systematic suppression of materials that contradicted the official version of events, creating educational environment where students learned only those aspects of their heritage that supported current policy objectives, while remaining ignorant of traditions and principles that might have provided foundation for criticism or resistance. The scholars and historians who might have preserved alternative accounts were either co-opted into service of the state narrative or eliminated as threats to the ideological unity that effective imperial expansion required. The educational reforms that accompanied this historical manipulation were designed to ensure that young Fire Nation citizens developed strong patriotic identity and unquestioning loyalty to their nation's imperial mission, while acquiring the practical skills and cultural attitudes that would make them effective administrators, soldiers, and colonists in the territories that Fire Nation expansion was bringing under their control. The curriculum that emerged from these reforms emphasized technical training and ideological indoctrination, while eliminating subjects that might encourage independent thinking or critical analysis of government policies and their consequences for both Fire Nation citizens and the peoples they were conquering. The censorship of historical textbooks and the creation of state propaganda that replaced accurate information with materials designed to support political objectives represented unprecedented attempt to control human consciousness itself, ensuring that future generations would be psychologically incapable of questioning the assumptions and values that made imperial expansion seem not only justified, but morally necessary for the welfare of humanity as a whole. The books that students read, the stories they heard, the examples they were given of heroic behavior and admirable achievement, all reinforced messages that portrayed Fire Nation conquest as liberation and resistance to such obviously beneficial changes as evidence of ignorance, selfishness, or corruption that justified whatever force was necessary to overcome it. The removal of courses that provided opportunity for personal expression from the educational curriculum reflected recognition that creativity and individual perspective posed potential threats to the ideological conformity that imperial administration required, artistic and intellectual independence being viewed as luxuries that peaceful societies might afford, but wartime necessities could not tolerate. The students who emerged from this revised educational system possessed technical competence and unshakable loyalty, while lacking the capacity for moral reflection or cultural criticism that might have enabled them to recognize the costs that their nation's achievements were imposing upon others and ultimately upon themselves. Fire Lord Azulon's succession to the throne upon his father's death ensured continuity of policies and objectives that had been established during Sozin's reign, while bringing to leadership someone whose entire adult life had been shaped by war and conquest, rather than memories of the peaceful prosperity that had characterized Fire Nation development during the golden age that preceded imperial expansion. Azulon's perspective on governance and international relations had been formed entirely within the context of military campaigns and colonial administration, his understanding of what effective leadership required being based upon experience that emphasized force and control rather than cooperation and mutual benefit. The global empire that emerged under Azulon's rule represented the full implementation of his father's vision for Fire Nation dominance, their territorial control extending across most of the known world, while their administrative systems transformed conquered peoples into subjects whose lives were organized according to Fire Nation priorities and values, regardless of their previous cultural traditions or personal preferences. The resources that flowed from this vast empire enabled further technological development and military expansion, while providing prosperity for Fire Nation citizens that seemed to validate their conviction that their way of life was superior to any alternative that other peoples might offer. The subjugation of most Earth Kingdom territory and former air nomad regions was accomplished through combination of military force and systematic cultural transformation that eliminated local identity and resistance while replacing traditional institutions with Fire Nation alternatives that served imperial objectives more effectively than previous systems had served local needs. The populations that survived conquest discovered that their continued existence depended upon accepting roles within Fire Nation society that utilized their labor and capabilities, while denying them political autonomy or cultural expression that might preserve dangerous memories of alternative ways of organizing social relationships. The industrial development that was funded through imperial resources represented unprecedented expansion of manufacturing capacity and technological capability that made Fire Nation civilization the most advanced that had ever existed, while creating economic relationships that bound conquered territories to the imperial center through networks of production and distribution that made independence increasingly impossible, even if political control was somehow eliminated. The railways that connected distant provinces, the steamships that moved goods and people across oceanic distances, the communication systems that enabled coordination of activities across continental expanses, all created infrastructure that served imperial purposes while providing practical benefits that made Fire Nation rule seem preferable to the chaos that would result from its collapse. The technological innovations that emerged from this intensive development included advances in metallurgy, engineering, and energy production that enabled construction of machines and structures whose capabilities exceeded anything that previous civilizations had achieved, while providing foundations for further progress that could extend Fire Nation advantages over any potential rivals who might challenge their dominance through military resistance or economic competition. The factories that produced these technological marvels became symbols of Fire Nation's superiority, while their products served both civilian and military purposes that strengthened imperial control through practical demonstration of what cooperation could achieve. The airships that represented the pinnacle of Fire Nation technological achievement during this period provided mobility and striking power that made their military forces effectively invulnerable to conventional opposition, while enabling rapid deployment of troops and supplies across distances that had previously required weeks or months of difficult overland travel. The psychological impact of these flying machines upon peoples who had never seen anything comparable was often sufficient to ensure surrender without battle. Their appearance in local skies serving as unmistakable demonstration that resistance was futile against opponents who possessed capabilities that seemed almost supernatural. The ethnocentric ideology that gradually replaced Sozin's original vision of sharing Fire Nation prosperity with other peoples reflected the practical realities of governing conquered populations who showed little appreciation for the prosperity benefits that imperial rule was providing, while maintaining stubborn attachment to inferior traditions and customs that interfered with efficient administration and optimal resource utilization. The theoretical commitment to improving conditions for everyone was replaced by more pragmatic recognition that Fire Nation interests deserved priority over the concerns of subjects whose welfare mattered only insofar as it served larger imperial objectives. The abandonment of prosperity sharing in favor of pure imperialist ambition was justified through ideological developments that portrayed conquered peoples as inherently inferior beings whose capacity for civilization was limited by racial and cultural characteristics that made them suitable for subordinate roles but incapable of achieving the levels of development that Fire Nation citizens took for granted. The policies that flowed from these beliefs treated subject populations as resources to be utilized rather than people to be served, their treatment becoming increasingly harsh as imperial priorities took precedence over humanitarian considerations that were dismissed as sentimental luxuries. The execution of Avatar-loyal fire sages that Azalon ordered represented systematic elimination of spiritual authority that might have provided alternative source of legitimacy or moral guidance that could challenge imperial policies on grounds that transcended purely political considerations. The ancient orders that had maintained Fire Nation connections to cosmic forces and universal principles were purged of elements that retained loyalty to Avatar traditions, while their surviving members were integrated into government-controlled religious institutions that served state objectives rather than spiritual truth. The subordination of spiritual institutions to government supervision transformed religious practice from source of independent moral authority into instrument of political control, the fire sages who remained in official positions becoming functionaries whose primary responsibility was supporting imperial objectives rather than maintaining authentic connections to cosmic forces or providing guidance based upon universal, spiritual, principles. The ceremonies and rituals that these compromised religious leaders conducted served propaganda purposes, while their teachings emphasized loyalty to Fire Nation rather than balance and harmony among all peoples. The environmental pollution that resulted from intensive industrial development began creating problems that would worsen throughout the remainder of the war. The factories and mining operations that generated imperial wealth, also producing waste and contamination that damaged ecosystems while making large areas unsuitable for traditional agriculture or healthy human habitation. The rural populations that suffered most from these environmental problems discovered that their complaints received little attention from imperial administrators, whose priorities emphasized production and expansion rather than sustainability or public health concerns that might interfere with military and economic objectives. The impoverishment that affected many rural areas despite overall imperial prosperity reflected the concentration of benefits in urban centers and colonial territories, while traditional communities bore increasing costs from environmental damage, military recruitment, and resource extraction that served imperial purposes at the expense of local welfare and long-term sustainability. The farmers and craftsmen who had once prospered under Fire Nation governance found their livelihoods threatened by industrial competition and environmental degradation, while their sons were conscripted for military service in distant territories where many would never return to contribute to their home communities. The mass buildup of industry toward the end of Azalon's reign represented preparation for final campaigns that would complete Fire Nation conquest of the remaining independent territories, while demonstrating to any potential opposition that resistance was utterly hopeless against forces that could mobilize resources and capabilities beyond anything that regional powers could hope to match through their own efforts or mutual cooperation. The scale of production that was achieved during this period created industrial capacity that could support military operations of unprecedented scope, while providing civilian goods that maintained popular support for policies that brought prosperity to Fire Nation citizens even as they imposed suffering upon conquered peoples. Fire Lord Ozai's succession brought to power someone whose entire worldview had been shaped by imperial ideology and military conquest, his understanding of leadership and governance being based entirely upon principles that emphasized force and domination rather than the cooperation and mutual benefit that had characterized Fire Nation development during its golden age. Centuries earlier, the technological advancements that continued under his rule were directed toward military applications that could ensure final victory over remaining opposition, while the political developments that occurred during his reign eliminated the last vestiges of moral restraint or spiritual guidance that might have moderated imperial ambitions. The fall of Ba Sing Se that occurred during Ozai's reign represented the culmination of Earth Kingdom resistance and the effective elimination of organized opposition to Fire Nation expansion throughout the continental territories that had once supported independent civilization and alternative approaches to governance and social organization. The conquest of the Earth Kingdom capital demonstrated that no fortress or defensive strategy could withstand Fire Nation military capabilities while providing access to resources and strategic positions that would support the final phase of imperial expansion into territories that remained beyond direct control. The re-emergence of Avatar Aang after a century of absence created crisis that threatened to undermine everything that 3 generations of Fire Lords had accomplished through their systematic conquest and transformation of the known world. The Avatar's return, providing spiritual authority and elemental mastery that could potentially reverse Imperial achievements, while inspiring resistance that had been discouraged by decades of apparently hopeless opposition to, obviously, superior forces. The intervention that the Avatar represented posed existential threat to Fire Nation Imperial Order while offering hope to conquered peoples who had learned to accept their subjugation as permanent and inevitable. As the 100-Year War approached its climactic phase, with the return of Sozin's Comet and Firelord Ozai's plans for using its enhanced power to complete the systematic destruction of all remaining opposition to Fire Nation Imperial dominance. The transformation of the world's most advanced and prosperous civilization into its greatest threat was complete, their capabilities and resources being directed toward objectives that would either establish permanent global tyranny or provoke resistance that could destroy everything their ancestors had built during centuries of patient development and wise governance that had once made them a model for other nations to admire and emulate, rather than fear and hate. The technological advancements that flourished under Firelord Ozai's reign represented the culmination of a century of industrial development and military innovation, their scientific achievements reaching unprecedented heights as the resources extracted from conquered territories funded research and development programs that pushed the boundaries of what human ingenuity could accomplish when freed from moral constraints and focused entirely upon maximizing destructive capability and administrative control. The weapons systems that emerged from these efforts combined traditional firebending techniques with mechanical engineering and chemical knowledge that multiplied their effectiveness beyond anything that previous generations of Fire Nation military leaders had imagined possible, while communication networks and transportation infrastructure enabled coordination of forces across continental distances with precision that made resistance seem futile to anyone who understood the scope of imperial capabilities. The enhanced metallurgy that had been developed through decades of experimentation with volcanic minerals and foreign ores created materials that could withstand temperatures and pressures that would have destroyed conventional weapons and armor, enabling construction of machines and fortifications that possessed durability and effectiveness that seemed almost supernatural to opponents whose own technological capabilities remained centuries behind Fire Nation achievements. The steel that was produced in Imperial foundries was harder and more resilient than anything available to Earth Kingdom smiths, while the alloys that Fire Nation engineers had perfected could be shaped into complex mechanisms that performed functions that their enemies could barely comprehend, much less duplicate through their own manufacturing processes. The fall of Ba Sing Se that occurred during the middle years of Ozai's reign represented more than simple military victory over the Earth Kingdom's most formidable defensive position, its conquest demonstrating that no fortress or strategic advantage could compensate for the technological and organizational superiority that Fire Nation forces had achieved through their systematic development of industrial warfare, capabilities, and professional military doctrine. The siege that preceded the city's capture showcased innovations in artillery, engineering, and tactical coordination that overwhelmed defenses that had been considered impregnable by everyone who understood conventional military science and strategic analysis. The drill that penetrated the outer wall of Ba Sing Se embodied Fire Nation engineering excellence in its most dramatic form. The massive machine representing synthesis of mechanical knowledge, metallurgical expertise, and strategic planning that enabled unprecedented assault on fortifications that had protected the Earth Kingdom capital for centuries. The successful breaching of walls that had never been seriously threatened by external forces provided psychological victory that was even more significant than the tactical advantage it created, demonstrating to defenders and potential allies throughout the world that Fire Nation capabilities had reached levels where traditional defensive strategies were no longer viable against Imperial forces. The internal corruption that Fire Nation agents had cultivated within Ba Sing Se's government and security apparatus proved equally important to the city's eventual fall. Their patient infiltration and manipulation of key institutions, having created vulnerabilities that military assault could exploit, while preventing effective coordination of defensive responses that might have enabled successful resistance. Despite the attackers' technological advantages, the Dai Li organization that had once protected Earth Kingdom interests became instrument of Fire Nation conquest, their loyalty purchased through promises of continued authority and enhanced status within the imperial system that would replace Earth Kingdom governance. The conquest of Ba Sing Se provided Fire Nation forces with access to the Earth Kingdom's accumulated wealth and strategic resources, while eliminating the last major center of organized resistance that could serve as rallying point for continued opposition to imperial expansion throughout the continental territories. The libraries, treasuries, and military arsenals that fell under Fire Nation control contained materials and information that could support further conquest. While the symbolic impact of the Earth Kingdom capital's surrender discouraged resistance movements that had previously maintained hope that effective opposition remained possible, the administrative systems that Fire Nation occupation forces immediately implemented in conquered territories demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of how to transform military victory into permanent political control. Their governmental structures, combining efficient resource extraction with social policies that provided sufficient benefits to collaborating populations, while making rebellion increasingly difficult and costly for anyone who refused to accept their new status within the imperial hierarchy. The bureaucrats and technical specialists who followed military forces into occupied regions brought knowledge and capabilities that could improve living conditions for cooperative subjects, while establishing surveillance and control mechanisms that prevented organized resistance. Avatar Aang's re-emergence after a century of suspended animation created crisis that threatened every aspect of Fire Nation imperial achievement, his return providing both spiritual authority and elemental mastery that could potentially reverse decades of conquest, while inspiring resistance movements throughout occupied territories that had learned to accept Fire Nation dominance as permanent and inevitable. The young Avatar's awakening from the iceberg represented resurrection of cosmic forces that imperial ideology had dismissed as obsolete superstitions, his very existence challenging fundamental assumptions about Fire Nation's superiority and historical destiny that had justified the suffering and destruction that conquest had required. The initial encounters between Avatar Aang and Fire Nation forces revealed that despite technological advances and military experience gained through a century of successful conquest, their soldiers and commanders were unprepared to face opposition that possessed abilities transcending conventional categories of combat capability and strategic planning. The airbending techniques that had been thought extinct since the genocide demonstrated effectiveness against Fire Nation tactics and equipment that had been developed to address known forms of resistance, While the Avatar's spiritual power provided access to forces that Imperial science had never learned to understand or counter effectively, the formation of Team Avatar around the returned bridge between worlds created nucleus for resistance that combined elemental mastery with practical knowledge of Fire Nation capabilities and weaknesses, their diverse backgrounds and complementary skills enabling approaches to opposition that no single individual or conventional military force could have achieved through traditional methods. The Waterbender, Earthbender, and Non-Bender who joined Aang's mission brought perspectives and abilities that had been shaped by their own experiences of Fire Nation occupation and oppression, their personal motivations providing emotional intensity that matched the cosmic significance of their shared objective. The liberation of various occupied territories that Team Avatar accomplished during their journey toward the Fire Nation capital demonstrated both the vulnerability of Imperial control when faced with truly determined opposition and the Fire Nation capital enthusiasm with which conquered peoples would embrace opportunities to reclaim their independence and cultural identity. The villages and cities that were freed from Fire Nation administration revealed how much resentment and resistance had accumulated beneath surface compliance with Imperial authority, while the knowledge and assistance that liberated populations provided enabled increasingly effective attacks on Imperial infrastructure and military positions. The invasion of the Fire Nation homeland during the solar eclipse that temporarily neutralized firebending abilities represented the culmination of international cooperation against Imperial expansion. The coalition of Earth Kingdom and Water Tribe, forces that participated in this assault, demonstrating that effective opposition to Fire Nation dominance remained possible when different peoples worked together toward common objectives. The careful planning and coordination that preceded the invasion showed that Fire Nation enemies had learned from previous defeats while developing capabilities that could exploit Imperial vulnerabilities when favorable opportunities arose. Fire Lord Ozai's plan to use Sozin's comet for implementing the final solution to global resistance represented logical extension of Imperial ideology, taken to its ultimate conclusion, his intention to burn the entire Earth Kingdom, revealing how completely the original vision of sharing Fire Nation prosperity had been corrupted into pure destructive ambition that recognized no moral constraints or practical limitations. The Phoenix King title that Ozai assumed for this climactic campaign embodied his conviction that Fire Nation Imperial destiny required elimination of all alternative ways of organizing human society. His enhanced firebending capabilities during the comet's passage, providing power that seemed adequate for accomplishing such comprehensive destruction. The industrial capacity that had been developed to support this final campaign included airship fleets and incendiary weapons that could devastate entire continents, while the enhanced firebending that the comet provided would enable destruction on scales that exceeded anything previously achieved. Through military conquest, the systematic burning of Earth Kingdom territories was intended not merely to eliminate remaining resistance, but to create tabula rasa upon which Fire Nation civilization could be rebuilt according to Imperial priorities without interference from local traditions or alternative approaches to governance and social organization. Avatar Aang's intervention during this climactic phase of the war required him to master all four elements, while accessing Avatar state power that connected him to cosmic forces and accumulated wisdom of all previous incarnations. His confrontation with Fire Lord Ozai, representing ultimate test of principles and capabilities that would determine whether spiritual balance could be restored or Imperial tyranny would achieve permanent global dominance. The battle between Avatar and Phoenix King embodied fundamental conflict between cooperation and domination, between harmony and conquest, between wisdom and power that had been building throughout the century of war. The defeat of Fire Lord Ozai through energy bending rather than conventional violence demonstrated that Avatar power included capabilities that transcended normal categories of combat while providing resolution that satisfied justice, without perpetuating cycles of destruction that had characterized the previous century of conflict. The permanent removal of Ozai's firebending abilities represented punishment that was both appropriate to his crimes and consistent with principles of preserving life that distinguished Avatar authority from the imperial ideology that had justified so much death and suffering throughout the Time D war years. Prince Zuko's redemption arc that culminated in his alliance with Avatar Aang represented possibility for transformation and moral growth, even within individuals whose early development had been shaped by imperial ideology and family dysfunction. His journey from antagonist to ally demonstrating that people could transcend their origins and choose principles that served universal welfare rather than narrow interests or personal advancement. The firebending instruction that Zuko provided to the Avatar combined technical knowledge with moral insights that reflected his own evolution from imperial tool to spiritual teacher. The discovery of true firebending from the last dragons provided both Avatar and redeemed Prince with understanding of their element's essential nature as force of life rather than destruction. Their encounter with Ran and Shaw revealing knowledge that had been lost during the imperial period when firebending had been perverted into instrument of conquest rather than expression of cosmic creativity and spiritual connection. The rainbow flames that the dragons demonstrated contained principles that could guide post-war reconstruction according to values that honored fire's true purpose while preventing future corruption of elemental abilities. Princess Azula's mental breakdown during the final stages of the war illustrated psychological costs of imperial ideology upon individuals who had been raised to embody its values while lacking emotional foundation and moral guidance that could have provided stability when external validation and political success were no longer available to support identity that had been constructed entirely around dominance and control. Her defeat at the climactic Agni Kai demonstrated that technical mastery without spiritual understanding was ultimately inferior to abilities grounded in authentic relationships and genuine principles. The end of the 100-Year War that followed Ozai's defeat created immediate challenges about how to transition from military conflict to peaceful reconstruction while addressing legitimate grievances and practical needs of all peoples who had been affected by imperial conquest and resistance warfare. The Fire Nation forces that surrendered throughout occupied territories represented millions of individuals whose entire adult lives had been shaped by military service and imperial ideology. Their reintegration into peaceful society requiring approaches that balanced accountability with opportunities for redemption and constructive contribution to post-war development. The liberation of Earth Kingdom territories that had been under Fire Nation control for generations revealed complex situations where colonial populations had developed genuine connections to their adopted homes, while local populations had experienced both oppression and benefits from imperial administration that made simple restoration of previous conditions inadequate for addressing current realities and future needs. The mixed families and integrated communities that had emerged during decades of occupation required policies that acknowledged their legitimate interests while respecting the sovereignty and cultural integrity of formerly occupied peoples. Prince Zuko's coronation as Fire Lord represented unprecedented opportunity for Fire Nation leadership that combined intimate knowledge of imperial capabilities and weaknesses with moral commitment to cooperation and peaceful development rather than conquest and domination. The new Fire Lord's personal experience of both privilege and suffering within the imperial system provided understanding that could guide policies serving justice and reconciliation, while his relationships with Avatar Aang and other former enemies created foundation for international cooperation that could address post-war challenges constructively. The immediate aftermath of the war's conclusion brought relief and celebration throughout the world, while also revealing the enormous scope of reconstruction work that would be required to heal damage caused by a century of conquest and resistance. The physical destruction of cities and infrastructure being accompanied by social and cultural wounds that would require generations of patient effort to address through policies that combined practical assistance with symbolic recognition of suffering that imperial expansion had inflicted upon innocent population. The promise of reform that Fire Lord Zuko made upon assuming power represented commitment to fundamental transformation of Fire Nation society and international relationships. His recognition that true security and prosperity could only be achieved through cooperation rather than domination, requiring systematic changes in governmental institutions, educational systems, and cultural values that had supported imperial expansion for 3 generations of Fire Lords, whose policies had ultimately threatened the very survival of their own people, as well as everyone else in the world. As the smoke cleared from the final battles of the 100-Year War and the world began the long process of recovery from the most destructive conflict in recorded history, the lessons learned through suffering and sacrifice provided foundation for building relationships between peoples that could prevent future wars, while enabling achievements that would have been impossible under continued imperial domination or fragmented resistance that served no constructive purpose beyond preventing immediate conquest at enormous cost in human life and cultural development. Fire Lord Zuko's ascension to the throne represented the beginning of the most ambitious reconstruction program in Fire Nation history, his comprehensive reforms addressing not only the immediate practical challenges of transitioning from wartime mobilization to peaceful development, but also the deeper, spiritual and cultural transformation that would be necessary to prevent future repetition of the imperial catastrophe that had brought suffering to millions, while ultimately threatening the survival of Fire Nation civilization itself. The young Fire Lord's personal experience of both imperial privilege and exile's hardships provided unique perspective on the costs that conquest had imposed upon conqueror as well as conquered. His understanding of power's corrupting potential, balanced by intimate knowledge of how quickly authority could be lost when exercised without wisdom or moral foundation. The resumption of cooperation with other nations that Zuko initiated required overcoming decades of accumulated resentment and suspicion that Fire Nation imperial aggression had created throughout the world, their former enemies understandably reluctant to trust promises of peaceful intention from people whose recent history demonstrated capacity for systematic deception and unprecedented brutality in pursuit of political objectives. The diplomatic initiatives that the new Fire Lord launched were designed not merely to end active hostilities, but to build relationships based upon mutual respect and shared commitment to principles that could prevent future conflicts, while enabling cooperation that served everyone's interests, rather than advancing one nation's dominance at others' expense. The world peace that emerged from these diplomatic efforts represented more than simple absence of military conflict, encompassing systematic cooperation on problems that transcended national boundaries while establishing institutions and precedents that could address future disagreements through negotiation and compromise, rather than force and coercion. The treaties and agreements that were negotiated during this period created frameworks for managing international relationships according to principles that acknowledged each nation's sovereignty and cultural integrity, while providing mechanisms for resolving disputes that inevitably arose. When different peoples with different priorities attempted to coexist peacefully, the prosperity that began to emerge from these cooperative relationships demonstrated practical benefits that peace could provide when former enemies redirected resources from military expenditures toward productive investments that improved living conditions for everyone involved. The trade networks that developed between former combatants created economic incentives for maintaining peaceful relationships, while the technological and cultural exchanges that accompanied commercial interaction enriched all participating societies in ways that conquest and occupation had never achieved, despite decades of imperial control over vast territories and populations. The appointment of Shu as Great New Sage represented Fire Lord Zuko's commitment to restoring spiritual authority that could provide moral guidance independent of political considerations. The traditionalist leader's selection demonstrating recognition that effective governance required balance between temporal power and cosmic wisdom that could prevent future corruption of leadership by ambitions that served narrow interests rather than universal principles. The Great New Sage's background in preserving ancient traditions provided knowledge and perspective that had been systematically suppressed during the imperial period, when spiritual authority had been subordinated to military objectives and ideological control. The supervision that the Great New Sage provided over Fire Sage institutional reforms ensured that spiritual leaders could relinquish their compromised loyalty to Fire Nation government while returning to theological and spiritual roots that connected them to cosmic forces rather than political authorities whose priorities might conflict with universal principles of balance and harmony. The Fire Sages, who had survived the imperial period's purges and corruption, were given opportunities to undergo spiritual renewal that could restore their authentic connection to sacred traditions while providing guidance that served spiritual truth rather than governmental objectives that had perverted religious institutions into instruments of political control. The re-establishment of Fire Sage independence from government supervision represented revolutionary change in how spiritual authority related to temporal power, creating separation that could prevent future corruption of religious institutions, while ensuring that political leaders had access to moral guidance that was not compromised by considerations of loyalty or personal advancement. The Fire Sages, who resumed their traditional roles, brought knowledge and perspective that had been preserved despite imperial attempts to eliminate or co-opt spiritual authority that might challenge political decisions on grounds that transcended immediate practical considerations or partisan political calculation. The demilitarization policies that Fire Lord Zuko implemented required dismantling military capabilities that had been developed over decades of imperial expansion, while maintaining sufficient defensive capacity to protect Fire Nation territory and interests from potential threats that might emerge from international instability or internal disorder. The reduction of military forces and conversion of war industries to civilian production created challenges about how to employ personnel and facilities that had been dedicated to conquest, while ensuring that essential security needs could be met through resources that were adequate for defensive purposes without threatening neighboring nations. The decolonization efforts that accompanied demilitarization proved even more complex and controversial, their implementation requiring careful attention to legitimate interests of all parties who had been affected by imperial expansion, while avoiding solutions that merely replaced one form of injustice with another. The Fire Nation colonists, who had built lives and communities in occupied territories during generations of imperial control, possessed legitimate claims to homes and livelihoods they had established through their own labor and investment, while formerly occupied peoples deserved restoration of sovereignty and cultural autonomy that imperial administration had denied them. The opposition that these policies encountered from Fire Nation colonists and imperialist sympathizers reflected genuine concerns about economic security and cultural identity, as well as ideological commitment to imperial values that had shaped their understanding of Fire Nation destiny and their own place within global political relationships. The violence that began escalating by the year 101 after the Great Comet's passage demonstrated how difficult it would be to achieve peaceful transition from imperial domination to cooperative internationalism when significant populations had economic and emotional investments in maintaining systems that served their interests at others' expense. The crisis that was created by conflicting demands for decolonization and colonist rights required innovative approaches that could address legitimate concerns of all parties while avoiding solutions that satisfied some groups by creating injustice for others. The negotiations that preceded final resolution of colonial questions involved not only Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom authorities, but also Avatar Aang, whose spiritual authority and cosmic perspective provided framework for addressing problems that purely political solutions might not be able to resolve satisfactorily without creating new sources of conflict that could undermine the peace that everyone claimed to desire. The harmony restoration movement that emerged from these negotiations represented attempt to address colonial questions through systematic return of occupied territories to their original sovereignty, while providing protections and basties, accommodations for Fire Nation populations whose lives had become deeply rooted in regions where they had lived for generations. The movement's initial approach emphasized clear separation between Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom territories, while providing transition periods that could enable orderly relocation of populations who chose to return to their original homelands, rather than accepting citizenship in restored Earth Kingdom regions. Fire Lord Zuko's cooperation with Avatar Aang and Earth King Kuei in addressing these complex problems demonstrated how former enemies could work together towards solutions that served everyone's interests when their efforts were guided by principles that emphasized justice and practical necessity rather than narrow political advantage or ideological purity that ignored human costs of implementing theoretical solutions. The three-way partnership that developed between Avatar, Fire Lord, and Earth King provided model for international cooperation that could address similar problems that might arise in future situations where competing legitimate claims required creative resolution. The transformation of the oldest Fire Nation colonies into the United Republic of Nations represented revolutionary innovation in political organization that acknowledged realities created by generations of imperial expansion while providing framework for governance that could serve diverse populations whose interests and identities had been shaped by historical experiences that transcended traditional national boundaries. The new republic's establishment provided precedent for addressing situations where conventional approaches to sovereignty and citizenship were inadequate for managing complex relationships between peoples whose lives had become intertwined through conquest and resistance. The end of Fire Nation imperialist era that this transformation marked was both practical achievement and symbolic victory for principles that emphasized cooperation over domination, their success demonstrating that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be changed through patient work and commitment to values that served universal human welfare rather than narrow group interests. The policies that enabled this transition combined idealistic vision with pragmatic recognition of limitations and constraints that realistic solutions needed to acknowledge, while working toward objectives that honored everyone's dignity and legitimate aspirations. The protection of Fire Nation colonist rights that was achieved through the United Republic's creation demonstrated that justice did not require punishment of innocent people whose only crime had been building lives within systems that they had not created, while ensuring that formerly occupied peoples could reclaim sovereignty and cultural autonomy that imperial expansion had denied them. The balance that was struck between competing claims provided model for addressing similar conflicts that might arise in other situations where historical injustices had created complex relationships between different groups with legitimate but potentially incompatible interests. The new Ozai Society insurgency that emerged during this period represented reactionary response to peaceful reforms by militants who preferred violence to accommodation, their terrorist activities demonstrating that not everyone was willing to accept changes that threatened their privileged position within imperial hierarchy, even when such changes were implemented through democratic processes that respected everyone's rights and provided opportunities for constructive participation in building more just society. The organization's attempts to reinstate the former Fire Lord through force revealed how dangerous extremist movements could become when they possessed resources and capabilities that had been developed for imperial purposes. The failure of attempts to restore Ozai as Fire Lord demonstrated both the effectiveness of security measures that had been implemented to protect democratic institutions and the limited popular support that extremist movements could command when most people experienced direct benefits from peaceful policies that served their practical needs better than imperial ideology that demanded sacrifice for abstract objectives. The defeat of militant reactionaries provided evidence that democratic change could be defended successfully when it was supported by populations who understood what they had to gain from cooperation and what they would lose from return to policies that had ultimately proven self-destructive. Fire Lord Zuko's 60-year reign that followed these initial challenges provided stability and continuity that enabled systematic implementation of reforms, while demonstrating that peaceful governance could achieve prosperity and security that imperial conquest had never delivered, despite its enormous costs in human suffering and material resources. The consistency of policy direction that characterized this extended period of leadership created confidence among both Fire Nation citizens and international partners that commitments made during the post-war transition would be honored over time, rather than being abandoned when immediate pressures or tempting opportunities might encourage return to previous approaches. The use of Fire Nation resources to help rebuild the Southern Water Tribe represented practical demonstration of how former enemies could become partners in addressing common challenges while building relationships based upon mutual assistance rather than exploitation or domination. The aid programs that were developed during this period provided technical expertise and material support that enabled rapid recovery from war damage, while creating precedents for international cooperation that could serve as model for addressing similar problems that might arise in other regions or time periods. The long-lasting good relations that emerged between Fire Nation and Water Tribes through these reconstruction efforts demonstrated how generous assistance provided without ulterior motives could create genuine friendship between peoples who had previously been separated by suspicion and resentment created through imperial aggression and resistance warfare. The cultural exchanges and commercial relationships that developed from initial humanitarian cooperation enriched both societies while providing practical incentives for maintaining peaceful relationships that served everyone's interests, rather than requiring sacrifice from some for others' benefit. The massive statue of Avatar Aang that was commissioned for Memorial Island in Republic City represented symbolic recognition of spiritual authority and moral leadership that had made peaceful resolution of conflicts possible while honoring sacrifice and dedication that had preserved hope during the darkest periods of imperial oppression. The memorial's location in the new international city demonstrated Fire Nation commitment to principles that transcended narrow nationalism while providing permanent reminder of lessons that had been learned through suffering about costs of abandoning spiritual wisdom in pursuit of temporal power. The symbol of peace and goodwill that this monument represented was recognized throughout the world as evidence that people and nations could change fundamentally when they were willing to acknowledge past mistakes while committing themselves to principles that served universal welfare rather than partisan advantage. The ceremonies that accompanied the statue's dedication brought together representatives from all nations in celebration of cooperation that had replaced conflict while providing inspiration for continued work toward objectives that could benefit everyone through patient effort and mutual support. Fire Lord Zuko's relinquishment of the throne to his daughter Izumi in the year 167 after the Great Comet demonstrated institutional stability and peaceful transition of authority that had been established through decades of effective governance according to principles that emphasized service rather than domination. The voluntary transfer of power provided evidence that Fire Nation political system had been successfully reformed to prevent future corruption by ambitions that might seek to perpetuate individual rule beyond appropriate limits while ensuring continuity of policies that had proven effective in serving both national and international interests. Fire Lord Izumi's succession brought to leadership someone whose entire life had been shaped by peaceful cooperation rather than imperial conquest. Her understanding of governance and international relations being based upon experiences that demonstrated benefits of working with other nations toward common objectives rather than attempting to impose. Fire Nation will, upon reluctant subjects through force and coercion. The policies that she inherited and continued represented accumulated wisdom about how political authority could serve constructive purposes while avoiding mistakes that had nearly destroyed Fire Nation civilization during its imperial period. The aid that Fire Nation provided to United Republic against Earth Empire threats demonstrated continued commitment to international cooperation and collective security that could address challenges requiring coordinated response from multiple nations working together toward common objectives. The military assistance and technological support that were provided during this crisis showed that Fire Nation capabilities could serve defensive purposes that protected democratic institutions and peaceful development, rather than threatening other people's sovereignty and cultural integrity through aggressive expansion. The strict non-aggressive policy that Fire Lord Izumi maintained in foreign affairs represented complete rejection of imperial ideology, while ensuring that Fire Nation would use military force only as last resort for defensive purposes when no alternative existed for protecting legitimate interests and democratic values from threats that could not be addressed through diplomatic negotiation or international cooperation. The commitment to avoiding war, except when absolutely necessary, demonstrated how thoroughly Fire Nation leadership had learned lessons about costs that aggressive policies imposed upon everyone involved, while providing model for other nations that might be tempted to use superior capabilities for advancing narrow interests at others' expense. As Fire Nation entered the modern era with its imperial past firmly rejected, and its commitment to peaceful cooperation thoroughly established through decades of consistent policy and successful international relationships, the transformation from world's greatest threat to reliable partner in addressing common challenges represented one of history's most remarkable examples of how peoples and nations could change fundamentally when they possessed leadership with wisdom, to recognize mistakes and courage to implement changes that served universal principles rather than narrow interests that had proven ultimately self-destructive for everyone involved. The succession of Fire Lord Izumi to the throne in the year 167, after the Great Comet brought to power a leader whose entire worldview had been shaped by the peaceful prosperity and international cooperation that her father's long reign had established as the foundation of Fire Nation governance, her understanding of political authority and national responsibility, reflecting principles that emphasized service to universal welfare rather than pursuit of dominance or expansion, that had characterized the imperial period whose devastating consequences remained visible throughout the world. Despite decades of reconstruction and reconciliation efforts, the Fire Lady, who assumed leadership of her nation, had grown up during an era when former enemies had become trusted partners, when technological advancement served humanitarian purposes rather than military conquest, and when Fire Nation identity was defined by contributions to global harmony rather than demonstrations of superior power over subjected peoples. The strict, non-aggressive foreign policy that Fire Lord Izumi maintained throughout her reign represented complete institutionalization of principles that had emerged from hard-won wisdom about the ultimate futility and self-destructive nature of imperial ambition. Her commitment to peaceful resolution of international disputes, reflecting not weakness or lack of capability, but recognition that lasting security and genuine prosperity could only be achieved through relationships based upon mutual respect and voluntary cooperation, rather than fear and coerced compliance. The diplomatic initiatives that characterized her approach to international relations emphasized patient negotiation and creative problem-solving that sought solutions serving everyone's legitimate interests while avoiding zero-sum competition that inevitably created grievances and instabilities that would eventually threaten the peace that everyone claimed to value. The rejection of imperialist ideology that this policy represented was so complete and thorough that it had become almost inconceivable to Fire Nation citizens that their government might return to aggressive expansion or attempt to impose their will upon other peoples through military force. The cultural transformation that had occurred during the decades since the 100-Year War's end, having created social consensus around values that made conquest morally unthinkable rather than merely politically inadvisable. The educational systems that had been reformed during Fire Lord Zuko's reign continued to emphasize critical thinking about historical experiences and their lessons while promoting understanding of other cultures that made students appreciate diversity rather than viewing differences as threats to their own identity and security. The commitment to using military force only as a last resort when no alternative existed for protecting legitimate interests demonstrated how completely Fire Nation's strategic thinking had been transformed from offensive to defensive orientation. Their military planning, focusing entirely upon scenarios where they might need to protect themselves or their allies from aggression, rather than considering opportunities for territorial expansion or resource acquisition through conquest. The professional military forces that Fire Lord Izumi maintained were trained and equipped for defensive operations that could deter potential threats while providing rapid response capability for humanitarian crises that might require international intervention to protect innocent populations from violence or natural disasters. The aid that Fire Nation provided to the United Republic during its confrontation with Kuvira's Earth Empire illustrated both their continued commitment to collective security and their sophisticated understanding of how authoritarian movements could threaten democratic institutions throughout the world when they were allowed to consolidate power without facing organized opposition from peoples who valued freedom and self-determination. The military and technological assistance that Fire Nation forces provided during this crisis was carefully calibrated to support legitimate government authority while avoiding any appearance of imperial intervention or attempt to impose Fire Nation preferences upon peoples whose right to determine their own political arrangements remained paramount. The Earth Empire threat that emerged during this period represented exactly the kind of aggressive expansionism that Fire Nation imperial policy had once embodied. Kuvira's systematic conquest of Earth Kingdom territories and her attempt to establish authoritarian control over diverse populations, serving as reminder of how quickly democratic institutions could be undermined when sufficient military capability was combined with ideology that justified oppression in the name of order and progress. The Fire Nation response to this challenge demonstrated their evolved understanding of when military intervention was necessary to preserve international stability and protect vulnerable populations from tyrannical government. The technological and logistical support that Fire Nation provided to United Republic forces during the conflict included advanced communications equipment, transportation assets, and strategic intelligence that enabled more effective coordination of defensive operations, while their industrial capacity was redirected toward producing materials and supplies that supported humanitarian relief efforts for civilians who had been displaced or endangered by Earth Empire expansion. The assistance was provided through established international frameworks rather than unilateral Fire Nation initiative, ensuring that their involvement served collectively agreed objectives, rather than pursuing hidden agenda that might compromise their partners' sovereignty or independence. The successful resolution of the Earth Empire crisis without requiring direct Fire Nation military intervention validated their approach of supporting collective security through multilateral cooperation while maintaining capabilities that could be employed when diplomatic solutions proved inadequate for addressing threats to international peace and democratic governance. The restraint that Fire Lord Izumi demonstrated during this period reflected confidence in diplomatic approaches combined with recognition that premature or excessive military involvement could undermine the very principles that such intervention was intended to protect and preserve. The cultural renaissance that flourished within Fire Nation during this period of international stability represented flowering of artistic and intellectual achievement that had been impossible during the imperial era when creative energy and scholarly inquiry had been subordinated to military objectives and ideological conformity that discouraged individual expression or critical examination of official policies and their consequences. The artists, writers, musicians, and philosophers who emerged during Fire Lord Izumi's reign produced works that explored themes of redemption, reconciliation, and the complex relationships between personal identity and collective responsibility, while drawing inspiration from diverse cultural traditions that had been preserved or recovered despite imperial attempts to eliminate or suppress alternative approaches to understanding human experience. The rediscovery of pre-war traditions that accompanied this cultural revival included restoration of Sun Warrior knowledge and practices that had been lost or forgotten during the centuries when firebending had been perverted into instrument of conquest rather than expression of spiritual connection to cosmic forces that maintained harmony throughout the natural world. The archaeological expeditions that Fire Nation scholars undertook to ancient sites revealed artifacts and techniques that demonstrated their ancestors' sophisticated understanding of fire's true nature as element of life and Deng, creativity rather than destruction and domination that imperial ideology had emphasized for political purposes. The dragon population that began recovering during this period represented one of the most significant achievements of Fire Nation conservation efforts. Their patient work to locate surviving individuals and create protected habitats, enabling gradual restoration of species that had been nearly eliminated during imperial period when dragons had been hunted for their supposed power-enhancing properties, rather than honored as sources of wisdom and spiritual guidance. The dragons who emerged from hiding to interact with human populations once again provided access to knowledge about firebending's original purposes and methods that enabled further refinement of techniques that served healing and construction rather than warfare and intimidation. The balance between technological advancement and spiritual values that Fire Nation society achieved during this period demonstrated how scientific progress and industrial development could serve humanitarian objectives while remaining consistent with respect for natural systems and cosmic principles that governed relationships between all forms of consciousness throughout the universe. The innovations that emerged from Fire Nation research institutions focused upon solving practical problems that affected quality of life for ordinary people, while their environmental policies ensured that economic development proceeded according to sustainable principles that preserved resources and ecological health for future generations. The role that Fire Nation assumed in global prosperity and modernization reflected their unique position as society that had experienced both the benefits and costs of rapid technological development while learning through bitter experience how such capabilities could be used constructively or destructively depending upon the values and objectives that guided their application. The expertise that they shared with other nations emphasized approaches that could improve living conditions and expand opportunities while avoiding mistakes that Fire Nation experience had revealed about environmental degradation, social inequality, and political corruption that could result from uncontrolled growth that served narrow interests rather than broad public welfare. The continued leadership that Fire Nation provided in industrial and technological development was exercised through international cooperation and technology transfer programs that ensured benefits were shared broadly, rather than concentrated in ways that might create new forms of dependency or inequality between nations with different levels of technical capability. The research and development initiatives that Fire Nation institutions supported included collaborative projects with scholars and engineers from all nations working together towards solutions that addressed common challenges while respecting cultural differences and local priorities that influenced how new technologies would be implemented and adapted. The environmental restoration programs that Fire Nation undertook during this period addressed damage that had been caused by industrial pollution and resource extraction during the imperial era, when production had been maximized without regard for long-term consequences or ecological sustainability that future generations would require for their own prosperity and health. The cleanup efforts that were initiated included rehabilitation of damaged ecosystems, development of cleaner production processes, and establishment of protected areas that could preserve biodiversity while providing space for natural recovery from previous exploitation and degradation. The rural development initiatives that accompanied environmental restoration provided economic opportunities and improved services for populations that had been neglected or harmed during the imperial period, when resources had been concentrated in urban centers and military installations that served conquest rather than civilian welfare. The infrastructure projects that were implemented included transportation networks, communication systems, and educational facilities that connected previously isolated communities to broader economic and cultural opportunities, while preserving local traditions and social structures that provided identity and meaning for rural populations. The poverty alleviation programs that Fire Nation developed during this period combined direct assistance for individuals and families in immediate need with systematic efforts to address underlying causes of economic inequality and social exclusion that had been created or exacerbated by imperial policies that had privileged some groups while disadvantaging others. The comprehensive approach that was adopted included job training, healthcare, educational opportunities, and small business development assistance that enabled people to improve their circumstances through their own efforts, while ensuring that basic needs were met for everyone, regardless of their economic situation or social status. The educational reforms that continued throughout Fire Lord Izumi's reign emphasized critical thinking skills and historical awareness that could prevent future repetition of mistakes that had characterized the imperial period, while promoting understanding of other cultures and appreciation for diversity that made international cooperation natural and beneficial, rather than requiring constant effort to overcome prejudice and suspicion. The curriculum that was developed included honest examination of Fire Nation history that acknowledged both achievements and crimes, while providing students with analytical tools and ethical frameworks that could guide their decisions as citizens and leaders. The teaching of true history that included comprehensive coverage of war crimes and their consequences represented revolutionary departure from imperial-era educational approaches that had emphasized propaganda and ideological indoctrination rather than factual accuracy and moral reflection, that could enable students to understand complex relationships between individual choices and collective outcomes. The textbooks and teaching materials that were created during this period provided balanced perspectives on controversial events, while encouraging students to develop their own judgments based upon evidence and ethical principles rather than accepting official narratives without question or critical examination. The cultural exchange programs that Fire Nation supported during this period created opportunities for citizens to experience other societies directly, while enabling foreign visitors to observe Fire Nation development and contribute their own perspectives and expertise to ongoing efforts at social peace and economic improvement. These programs included student exchanges, professional development opportunities, artistic collaborations, and scientific partnerships that enriched all participants while building personal relationships that supported continued international cooperation and understanding across cultural boundaries that had once seemed insurmountable. The transformation of Fire Nation identity that these various initiatives accomplished was so profound that citizens who had grown up during the imperial period sometimes found it difficult to recognize their homeland in the peaceful, prosperous, and internationally respected nation that had emerged from decades of patient reform and reconstruction work. The changes that had been achieved went beyond mere policy modifications to encompass fundamental alteration in how Fire Nation people understood their place in the world and their responsibilities toward other peoples, whose welfare was now recognized as inseparable from their own long-term security and happiness. The maintenance of Fire Nation cultural distinctiveness within this transformed international role demonstrated that cooperation and mutual respect did not require abandonment of particular traditions and values that provided meaning and patience. continuity for local populations, their unique contributions to global civilization being preserved and celebrated while harmful or destructive elements were eliminated or modified to serve constructive purposes. The festivals, customs, artistic traditions, and social practices that continued to characterize Fire Nation life reflected synthesis of ancient wisdom with modern understanding that honored the past while serving contemporary needs and future aspirations. The modern challenges that Fire Nation society continued to face during this period included managing rapid technological change that could disrupt traditional economic relationships and social structures while ensuring that benefits were distributed fairly and that negative consequences were addressed promptly and effectively. The governance systems that had been developed during the post-war period provided frameworks for addressing such problems through democratic processes that involved all affected populations in decision-making while maintaining institutional stability and continuity that could prevent temporary difficulties from undermining long-term progress toward shared objectives. The opportunities that emerged from Fire Nation's transformed international position included possibilities for contributing to solutions for global problems that required coordinated effort from multiple nations working together toward common goals that transcended narrow national interests or short-term political considerations. The climate change, poverty, disease, and conflict that affected various regions throughout the world provided challenges that Fire Nation expertise and resources could help address, while continuing processes of international cooperation and mutual assistance that had become central to their national identity and global role. As Fire Nation entered the modern era with its imperial past definitively rejected and its commitment to peaceful cooperation firmly established through generations of consistent policy and successful international relationships, the nation that had once threatened world peace had become one of its most reliable guardians. Their transformation representing proof that peoples and institutions could change fundamentally when guided by wisdom earned through experience and commitment to principles that served universal human welfare rather than narrow interests, that ultimately proved self-destructive for everyone involved, including those who temporarily benefited from systems based upon domination rather than cooperation, exploitation rather than mutual assistance, fear rather than trust, and conflict rather than the harmony that made genuine prosperity and lasting security possible for all conscious beings throughout the interconnected world that they shared as their common home and responsibility. And so concludes the epic saga of the Fire Nation, a tale that spans millennia from ancient lion turtle cities to modern industrial democracy. From the first humans who received fire as a gift to the warriors who wielded it as a weapon of conquest, from the darkness of imperial ambition to the light of redemption and cooperation, the Fire Nation's story is ultimately one of transformation and hope. Fire Lord Zuko's greatest victory was not won on any battlefield, but in the choice to transform his nation's legacy from conquest to cooperation, from oppression to opportunity. The Fire Nation learned that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in lifting them up, that real prosperity comes not from taking but from sharing, that lasting peace requires justice and understanding rather than force and fear. As you drift toward peaceful slumber, carry with you the Fire Nation's most important lesson, that no matter how far down the path of darkness one travels, redemption is always possible for those brave enough to change course. The flame that once burned to destroy can learn to burn to heal, to warm, to illuminate the path toward a better tomorrow. Rest well, knowing that even from the ashes of the greatest mistakes, phoenixes of hope can rise again.